Introduction. The Roseto Mystery. These people were dying of old age? That's it. Outlier. Something that is situated away from or classed differently from a main or related body. 2. A statistical observation that is marked different in value from the others of the sample. Roseto Valdfortore lies 100 miles southeast of Rome in the Apennine foothills of Italian province of Foggia, in the style of medieval villages. The town is organized around a large central square. Facing the square is the Palazzo Marchesale, the palace of the Sagis family, once the great landowner of those parts. An archway to one side leads to a church, the Madonna del Carmine, Our Lady of Mount Carmine. Narrow stone steps run up the hillside, flanked by closely clustered two-story stone houses with red tile roofs. For centuries, the Pisani of Rosetta worked in the marble quarries in the surrounding hills, or cultivated the fields in the terraced valley below, walking 4 and 5 miles down the mountain in the morning and then making the long journey back up the hill at night. Life was hard. The townsfolk were barely literate and desperately poor, and without much hope for economic betterment until word reached Rosetta at the end of the 19th century of the land of opportunity across the ocean. In January of 1882, a group of 11 Rosatans, 10 men and one boy, set sail for New York. They spent their first night in America sleeping on the floor of a tavern on Mulberry Street, in Manhattan's Little Italy. Then they ventured west, eventually finding jobs in a slate quarry 90 miles west of the city near the town of Bangor, Pennsylvania. The following year, 15 Rosatans left Italy for America, and several members of that group ended up in Bangor as well, joining their compatriots in the slate quarry. Those immigrants in turn sent word back to Roseto about the promise of the New World, and soon one group of Rosatans after another packed their bags and headed for Pennsylvania, until the initial stream of immigrants became a flood. In 1894 alone, some 1,200 of Rosatans applied for passports to America, leaving the entire streets of their old village abandoned. The Rosatans began buying land on a rocky hillside connected to Bangor by a steep, rutted wagon path. They built closely clustered two-story stone houses with slate roofs on narrow streets running up and down the hillside. They built a church and called it Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and named the main street on which it stood Garibaldi Avenue, after the great hero of Italian unification. In the beginnings they called their town New Italy, but they soon changed it to Roseto, which seemed only appropriate given that almost all of them had come from the same village in Italy. In 1896, a dynamic young priest by the name of Father Pasquale de Nisco took over at Our Lady of Mount Carmel. De Nisco set up spiritual societies and organized festivals. He encouraged the townsfolk to clear the land and plant onions, beans, potatoes, melons, and fruit trees in the long backyards behind their houses. He gave out seeds and bulbs. The town came to life. The Rosatans began raising pigs in their backyards and growing grapes for house-made wine. Schools, a park, a convent, and a cemetery were built. Small shops and bakeries and restaurants and bars opened along Garibaldi Avenue. More than a dozen factories sprang up making blouses for the garment trade. Neighboring Bangor was largely Welsh and English, and the next town over was overwhelmingly German. This meant, given the fractious relationships between the English and Germans and Italians in those years, that Roseto stayed strictly for Rosatans. If you had wandered up and down the street of Roseto in Pennsylvania in the first few decades after 1900s, you would have heard the only Italian, and not just any Italian, but the precise southern Foggian dialect spoken back in the Italian Roseto. Roseto, Pennsylvania was its own tiny self-sufficient world, all but unknown by the society around it. And it might well have remained so, but for a man named Stewart Wolfe. Wolfe was a physician. He studied digestion and the stomach and taught in the medical school at the University of Oklahoma. He spent his summers on a farm in Pennsylvania not far from Roseto. Although that, of course, didn't mean much, since Roseto was so much in its own world that it was possible to live in the next town and never know much about it. One of the times when we were up for the summer, this would have been in the late 1950s, I was invited to give a talk at the local medical society, Wolf said years later in an interview. After the talk was over, one of the local doctors invited me to have a beer, and while we were having a drink, he said, "You know, I've been practicing for 17 years. I get patients from all over, and I rarely find anyone from Roseto under the age of 65 with heart disease." Wolf was taken aback. This was the 1950s, years before the advent of cholesterol-lowering drugs and aggressive measures to prevent heart disease. Heart attacks were an epidemic in the United States. They were the leading cause of death in men under the age of 65. It was impossible to be a doctor, common sense said, and not see heart disease. Wolf decided to investigate. He enlisted the support of some of his students and colleagues from Oklahoma. They gathered together and death certificates from residents of the town going back as many years as they could. They analyzed physicians' records, they took medical histories, and constructed family genealogies. "We got busy," Wolf said. "We decided to do a preliminary study. We started in the 1961," the mayor said. "All my sisters are going to help you." He had four sisters, he said. "You can have the town council room," I said. "Where are you going to have the council meetings?" he said. "Well, we'll postpone them for a while. The ladies will bring us lunch. We had little booths where we could take blood, do EKGs. We were there for 4 weeks. Then I talked with the authorities. They give us the school for the summer. We invited the entire population of Roseto to be tested. The results were astonishing. In Roseto, virtually no one under 55 had died of a heart attack or showed any signs of heart disease. For men over 65, the death rate from heart disease in Roseto was roughly half that of the United States as a whole. The death rate from all causes in Roseto, in fact, was 30 to 35% lower than expected. Wolf brought in a friend of his, a sociologist from Oklahoma named John Brunn, to help him. I hired medical students and sociology grad students as interviewers, and in Rosetta we went house to house and talked to every person aged 21 and over. Brunn remembers this happened more than 50 years ago, but Brunn still had a sense of amazement in his voice as he described what they found. There was no suicide, no alcoholism, no drug addiction, and very little crime. They didn't have anyone on welfare. Then we looked at the peptic ulcers. They didn't have any of those either. These people were dying of old age. That's it. Wolf's profession had a name for a place like Roseto, a place they lay outside everyday experiences where the normal rules did not apply. Roseto was an outlier. Wolf's first thought was the Rosetans must have held out to some dietary practices from the Old World that left them healthier than other Americans, but he quickly realized that wasn't true. The Rosetans were cooking with lard instead of with the much healthier olive oil they had used back in Italy. Pizza in Italy was a thin crust with salt, oil, and perhaps some tomatoes, anchovies, or onions. Pizza in Pennsylvania was bread dough plus sausage, pepperoni, salami, ham, and sometimes eggs. Sweets such as biscotti and tarlali used to be reserved for Christmas and Easter. Risotto they were eaten year-round. When Wolf had dietitians analyze the typical Rosetan's eating habits, they found a whopping 41% of their calories came from fat. Nor was this a town where people got up at dawn to do yoga and run a brisk 6 miles. The Pennsylvania Rosetans smoked heavily and many were struggling with obesity. If diet and exercise didn't explain the findings, then what about genetics? The Rosicans were a close-knit group from the same region of Italy, and Wolf's next thought was to wonder whether they were of a particular hardy stock that protected them from disease. To track down relatives of Rosicans who were living in other parts of the United States to see if they shared the same remarkable good health as their cousins in Pennsylvania. They didn't. He then looked at the region where Rosicans lived. Was it possible that there was something about living in the foothills of eastern Pennsylvania that was good for their health? The two closest towns to Rosetta was Bangor, which was just down the hill, and Nazareth, a few miles away. These were both about the same size as Roseto, and both were populated with the same kind of hard-working European immigrants. Wolf combed through both towns' medical records for men over 65, and the death rates from heart disease in Nazareth and Bangor were 3 times that of Roseto. Another dead end. What Wolf began to realize was the secret of Roseto wasn't diet or exercise or genes or location. It had to be Roseto itself. As Brun and Wolf walked around the town, they figured out why. They looked at how the Rosetans visited one another, stopping to chat in Italian on the street, say, or cooking for one another in their backyards. They learned about the extended family clans that underlay the town's social structure. They saw how many homes had three generations living under one roof. And They learned of, they saw under one roof and how much respect grandparents commanded. They went to mass at Our Lady, Our Lady of Mount Carmel and saw the unifying and calming effect of the church. They continued 21 separate civic organizations in a town of just under 2,000 people. They picked up on the particular egalitarian ethos of the community, which which discouraged the wealthy from flaunting their success and helped the unsuccessful obscure their failures. In transplanting the Pisani culture of southern Italy to the hills of eastern Pennsylvania, the Rosicrucians had created a powerful protective social structure capable of insulating them from the pressures of the modern world. The Rosicrucians were healthy because of where they were from, because of the world they had created for themselves in their tiny little towns in the hills. I remember going to Roseto for the first time, and you'd see three generational family meals, all bakeries, the people walking up and down the streets, sitting on their porches, talking to each other, the blouse mills where the women worked during the day while the men worked in slate quarries, Brun said. It was magical. When Brun and Wolf first presented their findings to the medical community, you can imagine the kind of skepticism they faced. They went to conferences where their peers were presenting long rows of data arrayed in complex charts and referring to this kind of gene or that kind of physiological process that they themselves were talking instead of the mysterious and magical benefits of people stopping to talk to one another on the street and of having three generations under one roof. Living a long life, the conventional wisdom at the time said depended to the great extent of on who we were. That is our genes. It depended on the decisions we made depended on what we chose to eat and how much we chose to exercise and how effectively we were treated by the medical system. No one was used to thinking about health in terms of community. Wolf and Brun had to convince the medical establishment to think about health and heart attacks in an entirely new way. It had to get them to realize that they wouldn't be able to understand why someone was healthy if all they did was think about the individual's personal choices or actions in isolation. They had to look beyond the individual. They had to understand culture he or she was a part of, and who their friends and families were, and what town their families came from. They had to appreciate the idea that the values of the world we inhabit and the people we surround ourselves with have a profound effect on who we are. In Outliers, I want to do for our understanding of success what Stuart Wolf did for our understanding of health. Part 1, Opportunity. The Matthew Effect. Chapter 1. For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away, even that which he hath. Matthew 25:29. One warm spring day in the May of 2007, the Medicine Hat Tigers and the Vancouver Giants met for Memorial Cup Hockey Championships in Vancouver, British Columbia. The Tigers and the Giants were two finest teams in the Canadian Hockey League, which in turn is the finest junior hockey league in the world. These were the future stars of the sport, 17, 18, 19-year-olds who had been skating and shooting pucks since they were barely more than toddlers. The game was a broadcast on Canadian national television. Up and down the streets of downtown Vancouver, Memorial Cup banners hung from the lampposts. The arena was packed. A long red carpet was rolled out onto the ice, and the announcer introduced the game's dignitaries. First, the Premier League of the British Columbia, Gordon Campbell. Then, amid the tumultuous applause, out walked Gordie Howe, one of the legends of the game. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer boomed, Mr. Hockey. For the next 60 minutes, the two teams played spirited, aggressive hockey. Vancouver scored first early in the second period on a rebound by Mario Blazak. Late in the second period, it was Medicine's hat turn as the team's scoring leader. Darren Helm fired a quick shot past Vancouver's goalie, Tyson Sexsmith. Vancouver answered in the third period, scoring the game's deciding goal. And then what Medicine Hat pulled his goalie in desperation, Vancouver scored a third time. In the aftermath of the game, the players and their families and sports reporters from across the country crammed into the winning team's locker room. The air was filled with cigar smoke and the smell of champagne and sweat-soaked hockey gear. On the wall was a hand-painted banner, "Embrace the struggle." In the center of the room, and the Giants coach, Don Hayes, stood misty-eyed. "I'm just so proud of these guys," he said. "Just look around the room. There isn't one guy who didn't buy in wholeheartedly. Canadian hockey in a meritocracy, thousands of Canadian boys began to play the sport at a novice level before they're even in kindergarten. From that point on, there are leagues for every age class, and at each of those levels, the players are sifted and sorted and evaluated, with the most talented separated out, groomed for the next level. By the time players reach their mid-teens, and the very best of the best have been challenged into an elite league known as the Major Junior A, which is the top of the pyramid. And if your Major Junior A team plays for the Memorial Cup, that means you are at the top of the pyramid. This is the way most sports pick out future stars. It's the way soccer is organized in Europe and South America, and it's the way Olympic athletes are chosen. For that matter, it is not all different from the way the world of classical music picks its future virtuosos, or the way the world of ballet picks its future ballerinas, or the way our elite educational system picks its future scientists and intellectuals. You can't buy your way into the Major Junior A hockey. It doesn't matter who your father or mother is, or who your grandfather was, or what business your family is in. Nor does it matter if you live in the most remote corner of the most northerly province in Canada. If you have the ability, the vast network of hockey scouts and talent spotters will find you. And if you are willing to work to develop that ability, the system will reward you. Success in hockey is based on the individual merit, and both of those words are important. Players are judged on their own performance, not on anyone else's, on the basis of their ability, not on some other arbitrary fact. Or are they? This is the book about outliers, about men and women who do things that are out of the ordinary. Over the course of the chapters, I'm going to introduce you to one kind of outlier after another, to geniuses, business tycoons, rock stars, and software programmers. We're going to uncover the secrets of the remarkable lawyer. Look at what separates the very best from pilots who have crashed planes, and try to figure out why Asians are so good at math. And in examining the lives of remarkable among us, the skilled and talented and driven, I will argue that there is something profoundly wrong with the way we make sense of success. What is the question we always ask about successful? We want to know what they're like, what kind of personalities they have, or how intelligent they are, or what kind of lifestyles they have, or what special talents they might have been born with. And we assume that it's those personal qualities that explain how the individual reached the top. In the autobiographies published every year by billionaire, entrepreneur, rock star, celebrity, the storyline is always the same. Our hero is born in modest circumstances. By virtue of his own grit, talent fights his way to greatness. In the Bible, Joseph is cast out by his brothers and sold into slavery, and then rises to become the Pharaoh's right-hand man on the strength of his own brilliance and insight. In the famous 19th century novels of Horatio Alger, young boys born in poverty rise to riches through a combination of pluck and initiative. I think overall it's a disadvantage, Jeb Bush once said, of what it meant for his business career that he was the son of an American president and that brother of an American president and the grandson of a wealthy Wall Street banker and U.S. citizen. When he ran for governor of Florida, he repeatedly referred to himself as a self-made man. It's a measure of how deeply we associate success with the efforts the individual that few batted an eye at that description. "Lift up your heads," Robert Winthrop told the crowd many years ago in the unveiling of the statue of the great hero of American independence, Benjamin Franklin, "and look at the image of the man who rose from nothing, who owed nothing to parentage or patronage, who enjoyed no advantages of early education which are not open, a hundredfold open, to yourselves who performed the most menial services in the business in which his early life was employed, but who lived to stand before kings and died to leave a name which the world will never forget. In Outliers, I want to convince you that these kind of personal explanations of success don't work. People don't rise from nothing. We do owe something to parentage and patronage. The people who stand before kings may look like they did it all by themselves, but in fact they are invariably the beneficiaries of hidden advantages and extraordinary opportunities and cultural legacies that allow them to learn and work hard and make sense of the world in ways others cannot. It makes a difference where and when we grew up. The culture we belong to and the legacies passed down by our forebears shape the patterns of our achievements in ways we cannot begin to imagine. It's not enough to ask what successful people are like in other words, it is only by asking where they are from that we can unravel the logic behind who succeeds and who doesn't. Biologists often talk about the ecology of an organism. The tallest oak in the forest is the tallest not just because it grew from the hardiest acorn, it is the tallest also because no other trees blocked its sunlight. The soil around it was deep and rich. No rabbit chewed through its bark as a sapling, and no lumberjacks cut it down before it matured. We all know the successful people come from hardy seeds, but do we know enough about the sunlight that warmed them, the soil in which they put down their roots, and the rabbits and lumberjacks they were lucky enough to avoid? This is not a book about tall trees, it's a book about forests, and hockey is a good place to start, because the explanation for who gets to the top of the hockey world is a lot more interesting and complicated than it looks. In fact, it's downright peculiar. Here's a player roster of the 2007 Edison Tigers. Take a close look and see if you can spot anything strange about it. Do you see it? Don't feel bad if you don't, because for many years in the hockey world no one did. It wasn't until the mid 1980s, in fact, that Canadian psychologist named Roger Barnsley first drew attention to the phenomenon of relative age. Barnsley was at the Lethbridge Broncos hockey game in southern Alberta, a team that played in the same major junior A league as the Vancouver Giants and the Medicine Hat Tigers. He was there with his wife Paula and their two boys, and his wife was reading the program when she ran across a roster list just like the one above that you just looked at. Roger, she said, do you know when these young men were born? Barnsley said yes. They are all between 16 and 20, so they've been born in the late 60s. No, no, Paula went on, what month? I thought she was crazy, Barnsley remembers, but I looked through it, and what she was saying just jumped out at me. For some reason, there was an incredible number of January, February, and March birth dates. Barnsley went home that night and looked up the birth dates of many professional hockey players as he could find. He saw the same pattern. Barnsley, his wife, and colleague A.H. Thompson then gathered statistics on every player in Ontario Junior Hockey League. The story was the same. More players were born in January than in any other month, and by an overwhelming margin, the second most frequent birth month, February, the third, March, Barnsley found that there were nearly 5.5 times as many Ontario Junior Hockey League players born in January as there were born in November. He looked at all the star teams of the 11-year-olds and 13-year-olds, the young players selected for elite traveling squads, same story. He looked at the composition of the National Hockey League, same story. The more he looked, the more Barnsley came to believe that what he was seeing was not a chance occurrence but an iron law of Canadian hockey. In any elite group of hockey players, the very best of the best, 40% of the players will have been born between January and March, 30% between April and June, 20% between July and September, and 10% between October and December. In all my years in psychology, I've never run into this effect this large, Barnsley says. You don't even need to do any statistical analysis. You just look at it. Look back at the Medicine Hat roster. Do you see it now? 17 out of 25 players on the team were born in January, February, March, or April. Here's the play-by-play for the first two goals at the Memorial Cup final, only this time I've submitted the players' birthdays for their names. It no longer sounds like the championship of the Canadian Junior Hockey. Now it sounds like a strange sporting ritual for teenage boys born under the astrological signs Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. March 11th starts around one side of the Tigers' net, leaving the puck for his teammate January 4, who passes it to January 22, flips it back to March 12, who shoots point blank at the Tigers' goalie. April 27 blocks the shot, but it's rebounded by Vancouver's March 6. He shoots. Medicine Hat defenseman February 9 and February 14th dive to block the puck while January 10 looks on helplessly. March 6 scores. Let's go to the second period now. Medicine Hat's turn. The Tigers' scoring leader, January 21, charges down the right side of the ice. He stops and circles, eluding the Vancouver defenseman, February 15. January 21 then deftly passes the puck to his teammate, December 20. Wow, what's he doing out there? Who shrugs off the onrushing defender, May 17, and slides a cross-crease pass back to January 21. He shoots. Vancouver defenseman March 12 dives trying to block the shot. Vancouver's goalie March 19 lunges helplessly. January 21 scores. He raises his hands in triumph. His teammate May 2 jumps on his back with joy. The explanation for this is quite simple. It has nothing to do with the astrology, nor is there anything magical about the first 3 months of the year. It's simply that in Canada, the eligibility cutoff for age class in hockey is January 1. A boy who turns 10 on January 2nd then could be playing alongside someone who doesn't turn 10 till the end of the year. At that age in pre-adolescence, a 12-month gap in the age represents an enormous difference in maturity. This being Canada, the most hockey-crazed country on earth, coaches start to select players for traveling the rep squad, the all-star teams, at the age of 9 or 10, and of course they are more likely to view as talented the bigger, the more coordinated players who have had a benefit of critical extra months of maturity. And what happens when a player gets chosen from a rep squad, he gets better coaching and his teammates are better, and he plays 50 or 75 games a season instead of 20 games a season like those left beyond in the house league, and he practices twice as much as or even 3 times more than he would have otherwise. In the beginning, his advantages isn't so much that he's inherently better, but only that he is a little older. By the age of 13 or 14, with the benefit of better coaching and all the extra practice under his belt, he really is better. So he's one more likely to make it to the major junior A league and from there into the big leagues. Barnsley argues that these kind of skewed age distributions exist whenever three things happen: selection, streaming, and differentiated experience. If you make a decision about who is good and who is not good at an early age, you separate the talented from the untalented, and if you provide a talented with a superior experience, then you're going to end up giving a huge advantage to the small group of people born closest to the cutoff date. The United States, football and basketball don't select, stream, and differentiate quite as dramatically as a result. A child can be bit behind physically in those sports and still play as much as his or her more mature peers, but baseball does. The cutoff date for almost all non-school baseball leagues in the United States is July 31st, with the result that more major league players are born in August than in over a month. The numbers are striking in 2005. Among Americans playing Major League Baseball, 505 were born in August versus 313 born in July. European soccer similarly is organized like hockey and baseball, and the birthday distributions in that sport are heavily skewed as well. In England, the eligibility date is September 1st, and in Football Association Premier League, at one point in the 1990s, there were 288 players born between September and November, only 136 players born between June and August. International soccer, the cutoff date used to be August 1st, and in one recent Junior World Championship tournament, 135 players were born in the 3 months after August 1st, and just 22 were born in May, June, and July. Today, the cutoff date for international junior soccer is January 1st. Take a look at the roster of the 2007 Czech Republic national. What the Czech national junior soccer team, which made the Junior World Cup finals. Here we go again. At the national team trials, the Czech soccer might have well as told everyone born after Midsummer that they should pack their bags and go home. Hockey and soccer are just games, of course, involving a select few, but these exact same biases also show up in areas of much more consequence, like education. Parents with a child born at the end of the calendar year often thinks about holding the child back before the start of kindergarten. It's hard for a 5-year-old to keep up with a child born many months earlier, but most parents once expecting that the whatever disadvantages a younger child faces in kindergarten eventually goes away. But it doesn't. It's just like hockey. A small initial advantage that the child born in the early part of the year has over the child born at the end of the year persists. It locks children into patterns of achievement and underachievement, encouragement and disencouragement that stretch on and on for years. Recently, two economists, Kelly Bedard and Elizabeth Dewey, looked at the relationship between scores on what is called the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, or TIMSS. TIMSS. Math and science tests given every or years to children in many countries around the world and month of birth. They found that among fourth graders, the oldest children scored somewhere between 4 and 12 percentile points better than the youngest children. That, as Dewey explains, is a huge effect. It means that if you Take two intellectually equivalent fourth graders with birthdays at the opposite ends of the cutoff date. The older student could score in the 80th percentile, while the younger one could score in the 68th percentile. That's difference between qualifying for a gifted program and not. It's just like sports do, we said, and we do ability grouping early on in childhood. We have advanced reading groups and advanced math groups. So early on, if we look at young kids in the kindergarten and first grade, that teachers are confusing maturity with ability, and they put on older kids in the advanced stream where they learn better skills. And the next year, because they are in the higher groups, they do even better. And the next year, the same thing happens, and they do even better again. The only country we don't see this going on is Denmark. They have a national policy where they have no ability grouping until the age of 10. Denmark waits to make selection decisions until maturity differences by age of evened out. Dewey and Bedard subsequently did the same analysis, only this time looking at college. What did they find? At four-year colleges in the United States, the highest stream of post-secondary education students belonging to the relatively youngest group in the class are underrepresented by about 11.6%. The initial difference in maturity doesn't go away with time. It persists, and for thousands of students, the initial disadvantages is the difference between going to college and having a real shot at the middle class and not. I mean, it's ridiculous, Dewey said. It's outlandish that our arbitrary choice of cutoff dates is causing these long-lasting effects and no one seems to care about them. Think for a moment about the story of hockey and the early birthday says about success. It tells us that our notion that is the best and the brightest who effortlessly rise to the top is much too simplistic. Yes, the hockey players who make it to the professional level are more talented than you or me. They also got a big head start, an opportunity that they neither deserve nor earn, and that opportunity played a critical role in their success. The sociologist Robert Merton famously called this phenomenon the Matthew effect, after the New Testament verse in the Gospel of Matthew. For unto everyone hath shall be given, he shall have abundance, but from him hath not shall yet be taken away, even which he hath. It is those who are successful, in other words, who are most likely to be given the kinds of special opportunities that lead to further success. It's the rich who get the biggest tax breaks. It's the best students who get the best teaching and most attention. And it's the biggest 9 and 10-year-olds who get the most coaching and practice. Success is the result of what sociologists like to call a cumulative advantage. The professional hockey player starts out a little bit better than his peers, and that little difference leads to an opportunity that makes that difference a bit bigger, and that edge in turn leads to another opportunity which makes the initially small difference bigger still, and on until the hockey player is a genuine outlier. But he didn't start out on the outlier, he started just a little bit better. The second implication of the hockey example is that systems we set up to determine who gets ahead aren't particularly efficient. We think starting all-star leagues and gifted programs as early as possible is the best way of ensuring that no talent slips through the cracks. But takes a look again in the roster for the Czech Republic soccer team. There are no players born in July, October, November, or December, and only one each in August and September. Those born in the last half year have all been discouraged or overlooked or pushed out of the sport. The talent of essentially half of the Czech athletic population has been squandered. So what do you do if you're an athletic young Czech with the misfortune to have been born in the last part of the year? You can't play soccer. The deck is stacked against you, so maybe you could play the other sport that Czechs are obsessed with, hockey. But wait, I think you know that's coming. Here's the roster of the 2007 Czech junior hockey team that finished 5th at the World Championships. Those born in the last quarter of the year might as well give it up on hockey too. Do you see the consequences of the way we have chosen to think about success? Because we so profoundly personalize success, we miss opportunities to lift others onto the top rung. We make rules that frustrate achievements. We prematurely write off people as failures. We are too much in awe of those who succeed and far too dismissive of those who fail. And most of all, we become much too passive. We overlook just how large a role we all play, and by we I mean society in determining who makes it and who doesn't. If we chose to, we could acknowledge that cutoff dates matter. We could set up two or even three hockey leagues divided up by a month of birth, let the players develop on separate tracks, and then pick all-star teams. If all Czech and Canadian athletes born at the end of the year had a fair chance, then the Czech and Canadian national teams suddenly would have twice as many athletes to choose from. Schools could do the same thing. Elementary and middle schools could put a January through April born students in one class, the May through August in another class, and those born in September through December in the third class. They could let students learn with the compete against other students of the same maturity level. It would be a little bit more complicated administratively, but it wouldn't necessarily cost that much money. And it would level the playing field for those who, through no fault of their own, have been dealt a big disadvantage by the educational system. He could easily take control of the machinery of achievement, in other words, not just in sports, but as we'll see in other more consequential areas as well. But we don't, and why? Because we cling to the idea that success is a simple function of individual merit, and that the world in which we all grow up and the rules we chose to write in society don't matter at all. Before the Memorial Cup final, Gord Waston, the father of one of the Medicine Hat Tigers, stood by the side of the ice talking about his son Scott. He was wearing a Medicine Hat baseball cap and black Medicine Hat t-shirt. When he was 4 and 5 years old, Waston remembered his little brother was in a walker and he would shove a hockey stick in his hand and they would play hockey on the floor in the kitchen morning till night. Scott always had a passion for it. He played rep hockey throughout his minor league hockey career. He always made the Triple-A teams. As a first-year Pee-wee or first-year bandman, he always played at the top rep team. Watson was clearly nervous. His son was about where the This one's about to play in the biggest game of his life. He had to work very hard for whatever he's got. I'm very proud of him. Those were the ingredients of success at the highest level: passion, talent, and hard work. But there were another element. When did Watson first get the sense that his son was something special? He always a bigger kid for his age. He was strong and he had a knack for scoring goals at an early age. And he was always kind of a standout for his age, a captain of his team. Bigger kid for his age, of course he was. Scott Washington was born on January 4th within 3 days of the absolute perfect birthday for an elite hockey player. He was one of the lucky ones. If the eligibility date for Canadian hockey were later in the year, he might have been watching the Memorial Cup Championship from the stands instead of playing on the ice. The University of Michigan opened its new computer center in 1971 in the brand new building on Beale Avenue in Ann Arbor, with beige brick exterior walls and a dark glass front. The university's enormous mainframe computers stood in the middle of the vast white room, looking, as one faculty member remembers, like one of the last scenes in the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. Off to the side were a dozen of key punch machines, what passed in those days for computer terminals. In 1971, this was the state of art. The University of Michigan had one of the most advanced computer science programs in the world, and over the course of the computer center's life, thousands of students passed through the White Room, the most famous of whom was a gawky teenager named Bill Joy. Joy came to the University of Michigan the year the computer center opened. He was 16. He was tall and very thin with a mop of unruly hair. He had been voted the most studious student by his graduating class at North Farmington High School outside Detroit, which as he puts it meant he was a no-date nerd. He had thought he might end up a biologist or mathematician. But late in his freshman year, he stumbled across the computer center and he was hooked. From that point on, computer center was his life. He programmed whenever he could. Joy got a job with a computer science professor so he could program over the summer. In 1975, he enrolled in a graduate school at the University of California at Berkeley. There, he buried himself even deeper in the world of computer software. During the oral exams for his PhD, he made a particularly complicated algorithm on the fly that, as one of his many memoirs has written, so stunned his examiners that one of them later compared the experience to Jesus confounding his elders. Working in collaboration with a small group of programmers, Joe took on the task of rewriting Unix, which is a software developed by AT&T for mainframe computers. That it be Joy's version was very good. It was so good, in fact, that it became the remains of the operating system on which literally millions of computers around the world ran. If you put your Mac in the funny mode where you can see the code, Joy says, I see things that I remember typing in 25 years ago. And do you know who wrote much of that software that allows you to access the internet? Bill Joy. After graduating from Berkeley, Joy co-founded the Silicon Valley firm Sun Microsystems, which was one of the most critical players in the computer revolution. There he rewrote another computer language, Java, and his legend grew still further. Among Silicon Valley insiders, Joy is spoken of with as much awe as someone like Bill Gates of Microsoft. He is sometimes called the Edison of the Internet. As the Yale computer scientist David Galanter says, Bill Joy is one of the most influential people in the modern history of computing. The story of Bill Joy's genius has been told many times, and the lesson is always the same. Here was a world that was purest of meritocracies. Computer programming didn't operate as an old boy network where you got ahead because of money or connections. It was a wide open field in which all participants were judged solely on their talent and their accomplishments. It was a world where the best men won, and Joy was clearly one of those best men. It would be easier to accept that version of events, however, if we hadn't just looked at the hockey and soccer players. Theirs was supposed to be pure meritocracy as well. Only it wasn't. It was a story of how the outliers in a particular field reached their lofty status through the combinations of ability, opportunity, and utterly arbitrary advantage. Is it possible the same pattern of special opportunities operate in the real world as well? Let's go back over the stories of Bill Joy and find out. For almost a generation, psychologists around the world have been engaged in the spirited debate over the question that most of us would consider to have been settled years ago. The question is this: is there such a thing as innate talent? The obvious answer is yes. Not every hockey player born in January ends up playing at a professional level. Only some do, the innately talented ones. Achievement is talent plus preparation. The problem with this view is that the closer psychologists look at the careers of the gifted, the smaller the role innate talent seems to play, and the bigger the role preparation seems to play. Exhibit A in the talent argument is the study done in the early 1990s by psychologist K. Anders Ericsson. With the help of the academy's professors, they divided the school's violinists into three groups. The first group were the stars, the students with the potential to become world-class soloists. The second were those judged to be merely good. The third were students who were unlikely to ever play professionally and who intended to be music teachers in the public school system. All the violinists were then asked the same question over the course of your entire career. Ever since you first picked up the violin, how many hours have you practiced? Everyone from all three groups started playing at roughly the same age, around 5 years old. In those first few years, everyone practiced roughly the same amount, about 2 or 3 hours a week. But when students were around the age of 8, real differences started to emerge. The students who would end up the best in their class began practice more than everyone else. 6 hours a week by age of 9, 8 hours a week by age of 12, 16 hours a week by age of 14, and up. Until by the age of 20, they were practicing, that is, purposely and single-mindedly playing their instruments with the intent to get better. Well over 30 hours a week. Like by the age of 20, the elite performers had each totaled 10,000 hours of practice. By contrast, the merely good students had totaled 8,000 hours, and the future music teachers had totaled just over 4,000 hours. Erickson and his colleagues then compared to the amateur pianists with professional pianists. The same pattern emerged. The amateurs never practiced more than about 3 hours a week over the course of their childhood, and by the age of 20, they had total 2,000 hours of practice. The professionals, on the other hand, steadily increased their practice time every year until by the age of 20, they, like the violinists, had reached 10,000 hours. The striking thing about Erickson's study is that he and his colleagues couldn't find any naturals musicians who floated effortlessly to the top while practicing a fraction of the time their peers did. Nor could they find any grinds, people who worked harder than everyone else, yet just didn't have what it takes to break the top ranks. Their research suggests that one musician has enough ability, the one performer over is how hard he or she works. That's it. That's more that the people at the very top don't work, just harder or even much harder than everyone else. They work much harder, much harder. The idea that excellence at performing complex tasks requires a critical minimum level of practice surfaces again and again in the studies of expertise. In fact, the researchers have settled on what they believe is the magic number for true expertise: 10,000 hours. The emergency picture from such studies is that 10,000 hours of practice is required to achieve the level of mastery associated with being a world-class expert in anything, writes the neurologist Daniel Levitin. And study after study of composers, basketball players, fiction writers, ice skaters, concert pianists, chess players, master criminals, and what have you, this number comes up again and again. Of course, this doesn't address why some people get more out of their practice sessions than others do, but no one has yet found a case in which the true world-class expertise was accomplished in less time. It seems it takes the brain this long to assimilate all that it needs to know to achieve true mastery. This is true even of people we think about as prodigies. Mozart, for example, famously started writing music at 6, writes the psychologist Michael Howe in his book Genius Explained. By standards of mature composers, Mozart's early works are not outstanding. The earliest pieces were all probably written down by his father, perhaps improved in the process. Many of Wolfgang's childhood compositions, such as the first seven of his concertos for piano and orchestra, are largely arrangements of works by other composers. Out of those concertos, the only contain music original to Mozart. The earliest that is now regarded as a masterwork, number 9, K.2-7-1, was not composed until he was 21. By that time, Mozart had already been composing concertos for 10 years. The music critic Harold Schlomberg goes further. Mozart, he argues, actually developed late, since he didn't produce his greatest work until he had been composing for more than 20 years. To become a chess grandmaster also seems to take about 10 years. Only the legendary Bobby Fischer got to take the elite level in less than the amount of time it took him 9 years. And what's 10 years? Well, it's roughly how long it takes to put 10,000 hours of hard practice. 10,000 hours is the magic number of greatness. Here's the explanation for what was so puzzling about the rosters of the Czech and Canadian national sports teams. There were practically no one of those teams born after September 1st, which doesn't seem to make any sense. You'd think that there should be a fair number of Checker, hockey, or soccer prodigies born late in the year who are so talented that they eventually make their way into the top tier as young adults despite their birth dates. But note to Erickson and those who argue against primacy of talent, that isn't surprising at all. That late-born prodigy doesn't get chosen for an all-star team as an 8-year-old because he's too small, so he doesn't get that extra practice. And without that extra practice, he has no chance at hitting 10,000 hours by the time the professional hockey team starts looking for players. Without 10,000 hours under his belt, there's no way he could ever master the skills necessary to play at the top level. Even Mozart, the greatest musical prodigy of all time, couldn't hit his stride until he had his 10,000 hours in. Practice isn't the thing you do once you're good, it's the thing you do that makes you good. The other interesting thing about 10,000 um, hours, of course, is that 10,000 hours is an enormous amount of time. It's all but impossible to reach that number all by yourself. By the time you're a young adult, you have to have parents who encourage and support you. You can't be poor, because if you have to hold down a part-time job on the side to help make ends meet, there won't be time left in the day to practice enough. In fact, most people can reach a number only if they get into some kind of special program, like Hockey All-Star Squad, or if they get some kind of extraordinary opportunity that gives them a chance to put in those hours. So back to Bill Joy. It's 1971. He's tall and gawky and 16 years old. He's a math whiz, the kind of student that schools like MIT, Caltech, and the University of Waterloo attract by the hundreds. When Bill was a little kid, he wanted to know everything about everything way before he should have even known. He wanted to know. His father, William, says we answered him when he could, and when he couldn't, just we would just give him a book. When it came time to apply to college, Joy got a perfect score on the math portion of the Scholastic Aptitude Test. It wasn't particularly hard, he says. Matter of factly, there was a plenty of time to check it twice. He has a talent of a true truckload, by the truckload. That's what the only consideration it never is. The key to his development is that he stumbled across the nondescript building on Beale Avenue. In the early 1970s, when Joy was learning about programming, computers were the size of rooms. A single machine, which might have less power and memory than your microwave now has, could cost upwards of millions of dollars, and that in 1970s dollars, computers were rare. If you found one, it was hard to get access to it. If you manage to get access, renting time on it costs a fortune. What's more, programming itself is extraordinarily tedious. This is the era when computer programs were created using cardboard punch cards. Each line of code was imprinted on the card using key punch machine. A complex program might include hundreds, if not thousands, of these cards in tall stacks. Once a program was ready, you walked over to whatever mainframe computer you had access to and gave the stack of cards to an operator. Since computers could handle only one task at a time, the operator made an appointment for your program, and depending on how many people were ahead of you in line, you might not get your cards back for a few hours or even a day. If you made even a single error, even a typographical error in your program, you had to take the cards back, track down the error, and begin the whole process again. Under the circumstances, it was exceedingly difficult for anyone to become a programmer and being expert. Certainly, becoming an expert by your early 20s was all but impossible. When you can program for only a few minutes out of every hour you spend in the computer room, how can you ever get in 10,000 hours of practice? Programming with cards, one computer scientist from that era remembers, did not teach you programming. It taught you patience and proofreading. It wasn't until the mid 1960s that solutions to the programming problem emerged. Computers were finally powerful enough that they could handle more than one appointment at once. If the computer's operating system was rewritten, computer scientists realized the machine's time could be shared. The computer could be trained to handle hundreds of tasks at the same time. That in turn meant the programmers didn't have to physically hand their stacks of computer cards to the operators anymore. Dozens of terminals could be built, all linked to the mainframe by the telephone line, and everyone could be working online all at once. Here's how one history period describes the advent of the time sharing. This was not just a revolution, it was a revelation. Forget the operator, the card, decks, the wait. With time sharing, you could sit at your teletype, bang in a couple of commands, and get an answer then and there. Time sharing was interactive. A program could ask for a response, wait for you to type it in, and act on it while you waited and show you result all in real time. This is where Michigan came in, because Michigan was one of the first universities in the world to switch over to time sharing. By 1967, a prototype of the system was up and running. By the early 1970s, Michigan had enough computing power that 100 people could be programming simultaneously in the computer center. Late 60s, early 70s, I don't think there was any place else that was exactly like Michigan. Mike Alexander, one of the pioneers of Michigan's computing system, said, maybe MIT, maybe Carnegie Mellon, maybe Dartmouth, I don't think there were any others. This is the opportunity that greeted Bill Joy, when he arrived on the Ann Arbor campus in the fall of 1971. He hadn't chosen Michigan because of its computers. He had never done anything with computers in high school. He was interested in math and engineering. When programming bug hit him in his freshman year, he found himself by the happiest of accidents, one of the few places in the world where a 17-year-old could program all he wanted. Do you know what difference is between the computing cards and time sharing, Joy says? It's the difference between playing chess by mail and speed chess. Programming wasn't an exercise in frustration anymore, it was fun. I lived in North Campus in the computing center when it was in North Campus, Joy went on. How much time did I spend there? Oh, a phenomenal amount of time. It was open 24 hours. I would stay there all night and just walk home in the morning. In an average week in those years, I was spending more time in the computer center than on my classes. All of us down there had his recurring nightmare of forgetting to show up for class at all, of not even realizing we were enrolled. The challenge was that they gave all of the students an account with a fixed amount of money, so your time would run out. When you signed on, you would put in how long you wanted to spend on the computer. They give you like an hour at time. That's all you'd get. But someone figured out that if you put in time equals and then a letter like T equals K, they wouldn't charge you, he said, laughing at the memory. It was a bug in the software. You could put in T equals K and sit there forever. Just look at the stream of opportunities that came Bill Joy's way. Because he happened to go to a far-sighted school like the University of Michigan, he was able to practice on the time-sharing system instead of with punch cards, because the Michigan systems happened to have a bug in it. He could program all he wanted because the university was willing to spend money to keep the computer center open 24 hours, and he could stay up all night. And because he was able to put in so many hours, by the time he happened to be presented the opportunity to write Unix, he was up to the task. Joe was brilliant. He wanted to learn that was a big part of it. But before he could become an expert, someone had to give him an opportunity to learn how to be an expert. At Michigan, I was probably the programming 8 or 10 hours a day, he went on. By the time I was at Berkeley, I was doing it day and night. I had a terminal at home. I'd stay up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning watching old movies and programming. Sometimes I'd fall asleep at the keyboard, he mimed, his head falling on the keyboard. And you know how the key repeats until the end and starts to go beep, beep, beep? After that happens 30 times, you have to go to bed. I was still relatively incompetent even when I got to Berkeley. I was proficient by my second year there. That's when I wrote programs that are still in use today. 30 years later, he paused for a moment to do the math in his head, which for someone like Bill Joy doesn't take very long. Michigan in 1971, programming in earnest by sophomore year, add in the summers, then days and nights his first year, so maybe 10,000 hours, he said finally. That's about right. In the 10,000 hour rule, a general rule of success, if we scratch below the surface of every great achiever, do we always find the equivalent of the Michigan Computer Center or hockey all-star team, some sort of special opportunity for practice? Let's test the idea with two examples, and for the sake of simplicity, let's make them as familiar as possible. The Beatles, one of the most famous rock bands ever, the Bill Gates, one of the world's richest men, the Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr came to the United States in February of 1964, starting the so-called British invasion of the American music scene and putting out a string of his hit records that transformed the face of popular music. The first interesting thing about the Beatles, for our purposes, is how long they had already been together. By the time they reached the United States, Lennon and McCartney first started playing together in 1957. 7 years prior to landing in America, that time that elapsed between their founding and their arguably greatest artistic achievements, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the Beatles' White Album, is 10 years. And if you look even more closely at those long years of preparation, you'll find an experience that in the context of hockey players, Bill Joy and the world-class violinist sound awfully familiar. In 1960, while they were still just a struggling high school rock band, they were invited to play in Hamburg, Germany. Hamburg in those days did not have a rock and roll music club. It had strip clubs, says Philip Norman, who wrote the Beatles biography Shout. There was one particularly large club owner called Bruno, who was originally a fairground showman. He had an idea of bringing in rock groups to play in various clubs. They had this formula. It was a huge non-stop show, hour after hour, with a lot of people lurching in and other lot lurching out, and the bands would play all the time to catch the passing traffic. In the American red light district, they would call it non-stop striptease. Many of the bands that played in Hamburg were from Liverpool, Norman went on. It was an accident. Bruno went to London to look for bands, but he happened to meet an entrepreneur from Liverpool and Soho who was down in London by pure chance, and he arranged to send some bands over. That's how the connection was established. Eventually, the Beatles made a connection not just with Bruno, but with other club owners as well. They kept going back because they got a lot of alcohol and a lot of sex. And what was so special about Hamburg, it wasn't that it paid well, it didn't, or that the acoustics were fantastic. They weren't, or that audience were savvy and appreciative. They were anything but. It was the sheer amount of time the band was forced to play. Here is John Lennon in an interview after the Beatles disbanded talking about the band's performance at the Hamburg strip club called Indra. We got better and got more confidence. We couldn't help with all the experience playing all night long. Wasn't handy them being foreign. We had to try even harder. Put our heart and soul into it to get ourselves over. In Liverpool, we'd only ever done 1 hour sessions and we just used to do our best numbers, the same ones that everyone in Hamburg. We had to play for 8 hours, so we really had to find a new way of playing. 8 hours? Here's Pete Best, the Beatles drummer at the time. Once the news got out about what we were making a show, the club started packing them in. We played 7 nights a week. The first we played almost non-stop till 12:30 when it closed, but as we got better, the crowd stayed till the two most mornings. 7 days a week, the Beatles ended up traveling to Hamburg 5 times between 1960 and the end of 1962. On the first trip, they played 106 nights, 5 or more hours a night. On the second trip, they played 92 times. On the third trip, they played 48 times for a total of 172 hours on stage. The last two Hamburg gigs in November, December 1962 involved another 90 hours of just performing. All told, they performed for 270 nights in just over a year and a half. By the time they had their first burst of success in 1964, in fact, they had performed live an estimated 1,200 times. Do you know how extraordinary that is? Most bands today don't perform 1,200 times. Do you know how what the most bands say they don't perform 1,200 times in their entire careers? The Hamburg Crucible is one of the things that set Beatles apart. They were no good on stage when they went there, and they were very good when they came back. Norman went on. They learned not only stamina, they had to learn an enormous amount of numbers, cover versions of everything that you can think of, not just rock and roll, a bit of jazz too. They weren't disciplined on stage at all before that, but when they came back, they sounded like no one else. It was the making of them. Let's now turn to the history of Bill Gates. His story is almost as well known as the Beatles. Brilliant young math whiz discovers computer programming, drops out of Harvard, starts a little computer company called Microsoft with his friends. Through sheer brilliance and ambition and guts, builds it into a giant of the software world. That's the broad outline. Let's dig a little bit deeper. Gates' father was a wealthy lawyer in Seattle, and his mother was the daughter of a well-to-do banker. As a child, Bill was precocious and easily bored by his studies, so his parents took him out of public school at the beginning of the seventh grade and sent him to Lakeside, a private school that catered to Seattle's elite families. Midway through Gates' second year at Lakeside, the school started a computer club. The Mothers Club at school did a rummage sale every year, and there was always question of what the money would go to. Gates remembers, some went to the summer program where intercity kids would come up to campus, some of it would go for the teachers. The years they put $3,000 in the computer terminal down in this little funny little room that we subsequently took control it was kind of amazing things. It was an amazing thing, of course, because this was 1968. Most colleges didn't have computer clubs in the 1960s. Even more remarkable was the kind of Lakeside bought. The school didn't have its students learn programming by the laborious computer card system, like virtually everyone else was doing in the 1960s. Instead, Lakeside installed what we call the ASR-33 teletype, which was a time-sharing terminal with a direct link to the mainframe computer in downtown Seattle. The whole idea of time sharing only got invented in the 1965. Gates continued. Someone was pretty forward-looking. Bill Joy got an extraordinary early opportunity to learn programming on the timeshare system as a freshman in college. In 1971, Bill Gates got to do a real-time programming as an eighth grader in 1968. From that moment forward, Gates, excuse me, lived in the computer room. He and a number of others began to teach themselves how to use this strange new device. Buying time on the mainframe computer and that ASR was hooked up to was of course expensive, even for the wealthy institution like Lakeside, and it wasn't long before the $3,000 put up by the Mothers Club ran out. The parents raised more money, the students spent it, then the group of programmers at the University of Washington formed an outfit called the Computer Center Corporation, or C Cubed, which leased computer time to local companies. As luck would have it, one of the founders of the firm, Monique Rona, had a son at Lakeside. A year ahead of Gates with the Lakeside Computer Club, Rona wondered like to test out the company's software programs on the weekends in exchange for free programming time. Absolutely! After school, Gates took the bus to C Cubed offices and programmed long into the evening. C Cubed eventually went bankrupt, so Gates and his friends began hanging around the computer center at a University of Washington. For long, they latched onto the outfit called ISI, Information Sciences Incorporated, which agreed to let them have free computer time in exchange for working on a piece of software that could be used to automate company payrolls in one 7-month period. In 1971, Gates and his cohorts ran up 1,575 hours of computer time on the ISI mainframe, which averages out to 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was my obsession, Gates says, of his early high school years. I skipped athletics. I went up there at night. We were programming on weekends. It would be a rare week that we wouldn't get 20 or 30 hours in. There was a period where Paul Allen and I got in trouble for stealing a bunch of passwords and crashing the system. We got kicked out. I didn't get to use the computer the whole summer. This is when I was 15 and 16. Then I found out Paul had found a computer that was free at the University of Washington. They had these machines in the medical center and the physics department. They were on a 24-hour schedule, but with this big slack period, so that between 3 and 6 in the morning they never scheduled anything. Gates laughed. I'd leave at night after my bedtime. I would walk up to the University of Washington from my house, or I'd take the bus. That's why I'm always so generous to the University of Washington, because they let me steal so much computer time. Years later, Gates' mother said, we always wondered why it was so hard for him to get up in the morning. One of the founders of ISI, Bud Pembroke, then got a call from the technology company TRW, which had just signed the contract to set up the computer system at a huge Bonneville Power Station, the Southern Washington State. TRW desperately needed programmers familiar with the particular software the power station used in these early days of the computer revolution. Programmers with this kind of specialized experience were hard to find, but Pembroke knew exactly whom to call. Those high school kids from Lakeside who had been running up thousands of hours of computer time on the ISI mainframe. Gates was now in his senior year, and somehow he managed to convince his teachers to let him decamp from Boneville under his guise of an independent study project. There, he spent the spring writing code supervised by a man named John Norton, who Gates says taught him as much about programming as almost anyone he'd ever met. Those 5 years from 8th grade through the end of high school were Bill Gates' Hamburg, and by any measure he was presented with an even more extraordinary series of opportunities than Bill Joy. Opportunity number one was that Gates got sent to Lakeside. How many high schools in the world has access to a time-sharing terminal in 1968? Opportunity number two was that mothers at Lakeside had enough money to pay for the school's computer fees. Number three was that when the money ran out, one of the parents happened to work at C Cube, which happened to need someone to check its code on the weekends, which also happened not to care if weekends turned into weeknights. Number four was that Gates just happened to find out that ISI just happened to needs someone to work on its payroll software. Number five was that Gates happened to live within walking distance of University of Washington. Number six was that the university happened to have free computer time between 3 and 6 in the morning. Number 7 was that TRW happened to call Bud Pembroke. Number 8 was that the best programmers Pembroke knew for that particular problem happened to be two high school kids. And number 9 was that Lakeside was willing to let those kids spend their spring terms miles away writing code. And what did virtually all of those opportunities have in common? They gave Bill Gates extra time to practice the by the time Gates dropped out of Harvard after his sophomore year to try his hand at his own software company, he'd been programming practically non-stop for 7 consecutive years. He was way past $10,000. How many teenagers in the world had the kind of experience Gates had? If there were 50 in the world, I'd be stunned. He says there was C cubed in the payroll stuff we did, then TRW, all those things that came together. I had a better exposure to software development at a young age than I think anyone did in the period of time, and all because of an incredibly lucky series of events. If we put the stories of hockey players and Beatles and Bill Joy and Bill Gates together, I think we get a more complete picture of the path to success. Joy, Gates, and the Beatles are undeniably talented. Lennon and McCartney had a musical gift in the sort that comes along once in a generation. And Bill Joy, let us not forget, had a mind so quick that he was able to make up a complicated algorithm on the fly that left his professors in awe. That much is obvious, but what truly distinguishes their histories is not their extraordinary talent, but their extraordinary opportunities. The Beatles, for the most random of reasons, got invited to go to Hamburg. Without Hamburg, the Beatles might have as well taken a different path. I was very lucky, Bill Gates said at the beginning of our interview. That doesn't mean he isn't brilliant or an extraordinary entrepreneur. It just means that he understands that incredible good fortune was to be at Lakeside in 1968. All the outliers we looked so far were beneficiaries of some kind of unusual opportunity. Lucky breaks don't seem like an exception with software billionaires and rock bands and star athletes. They seem like the rule. Let me give you one final example of a hidden opportunities that outliers benefit from. Suppose we do another version of the calendar analysis we did in the previous chapter of the hockey players, only this time looking at birth years, not birth months. To start with, take a close look at the following list of the 75 richest people in human history. The net worth of each person is calculated in current US dollars. As you can see, it includes queens and kings and pharaohs from centuries past, as well as the contemporary billionaires such as Warren Buffett and Carlos Slim. Do you know what is interesting about that list? Of the 75 names, an astonishing 14 are Americans born within 9 years of one another in the mid 19th century. Think about that for a moment. Historians start with Cleopatra and the pharaohs and comb through every year in the human history ever since, looking at every corner of the world for evidence and extraordinary wealth, and almost 20% of names they end up with come from a single generation and single country. Here's a list of those Americans and their birth years. John D. Rockefeller, born in 1839. Andrew Carnegie, 1835. Frederick Weyerhaeuser, 1834. Jay Gould, 1836. Marshall Field, 1834. George F. Baker, 1840. Haiti Green, 1834. James G. Fair, 1831. Henry H. Rogers, 1840. J. P. Morgan, 1837. Oliver H. Payne, 1839. George Pullman, 1831. Peter Arrow Brown Widener, 1834. Philip Danforth Armour, 1832. What's going on here? The answer becomes obvious if you think about it. In the 1860s and 1870s, the transformation in its history, this was when railroads were built and when Wall Street emerged. It was when industrial manufacturing started in earnest. It was when all rules by which the traditional economy had functioned were broken and remade. What this list says is that it really matters how old you were and when that transformation happened. If you were born in the late 1840s, you were too young to take advantage of that moment. If you were born in the 1820s, you were too old. Your mindset was shaped by the pre-Civil War paradigm. But there was a particular narrow 9-year window that was just perfect for seeing the potential the future held. All of the 14 men and women on that list above had a vision and talent, but they also were given extraordinary opportunity in the same way that hockey and soccer players born in January, February, and March are given an extraordinary opportunity. Now let's do the same kind of analysis for people like Bill Joy and Bill Gates. If you talk to veterans of the Silicon Valley, they'll tell you that the most important date in the history of the personal computer revolution was January of 1975. That was when the magazine Popular Electronics ran a cover story on the extraordinary machine called the Altair 8800. That Altair cost $397. It was a do-it-yourself contraption that you could assemble at home. The headline on the story read, Project Breakthrough, world's first mini-computer kit to rival commercial models. To the readers of Popular Electronics in those days, the Bible of the fledgling software and computer world, that headline was a revelation. Computers up to that point had been the massive expensive mainframes of sorts sitting in the white expanse of the Michigan Computer Center. For years every hacker and electronics whiz had dreamt of the day when the computer would come along that was small and inexpensive, enough for an ordinary person to use and own. That day had finally arrived. In January 1975 was the dawn of personal computers age, then who would be in the best position to take advantage of it? The same principle apply here that applied to the era of John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. If you're too old in the 1975, then you'd already have a job at IBM out of college. And once people started at IBM, they had a real hard time making the transition to the new world, says Nathan Myhrvold, who was a top executive at Microsoft for many years. You had this multi-billion dollar company making mainframes, and if you were a part of that, you'd think, why you screw around with these little pathetic computers? That was the computer industry to those people, and it had nothing to do with this new revolution. They were blinded by the being the only vision of computing. They made a nice living. It's just that there was no opportunity to become a zillionaire and make an impact on the world. If you were more than a few years out of college in 1975, then you belong to the old paradigm. You had just bought a house, you're married, a baby's on the way, you're in no position to give up a good job and pension for some pie in the sky. The $197 computer kit. So let's rule out all those born before, say, 1952. At the same time, though, you don't want to be too young. You really want to get into the ground floor, right? In 1975, and you can't do that if you're still in high school. So let's also rule out anyone born after, say, 1958. The perfect age to be in 1975, in other words, is old enough to be a part of the coming revolution, but not so old that you miss it. Ideally, you want to be 20 or 21, which is to say born in 1954 or 1955. There's an easy way to test this theory. When Bill Gates was born. Bill Gates, October 28th, 1955. That's the perfect birth date. Gates is a hockey player born on January 1st. Gates' best friend at Lakeside was Paul Allen. He also hung out in the computer room with Gates and shared those long evenings at ISI and CQ'd. Allen went on to found Microsoft with Bill Gates. When was Paul Allen born? Paul Allen, January 21, 1953. The third richest man at Microsoft is the one who's been running the company on a day-to-day basis since 2000. One of the most respected executives in the software world, Steve Ballmer. Ballmer's birthday? Steve Ballmer, March 24th, 1956. Let's not forget the man everybody's famous as Gates, Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple. Computer. Unlike Gates, Jobs wasn't from a rich family, and he didn't go to Michigan like Joy, but it doesn't take so much investigation of his upbringing to realize that he had his handbrake too. He grew up in Mountain View, California, just south of San Francisco, which is the absolute epicenter of the Silicon Valley. His neighborhood was filled with engineers from Hewlett Packard, and then as now one of the most important electronic firms in the world. As a teenager, he prowled the flea markets of Mountains View, where electronics hobbyists and tinkerers sold spare parts. Jobs came of age breathing the air of very business he would later dominate. This paragraph from Accidental Millionaire, one of the many Jobs biographies, give us a sense of how extraordinary his childhood experiences were. Jobs attended evening talks by Hewlett Packard scientists. The talks were about the latest advances in electronics and Jobs, exercising the style that was trademark of his personality, collared Hewlett Packard engineers and drew additional information from them. Once he even called Bill Hewlett, one of the company's founders, to request parts. Jobs not only received the parts he asked for, he managed to wrangle a summer job. Jobs works on an assembly line to build computers, and so fascinated that he tried to design his own. Wait, Bill Hewlett gave him spare parts? That's on par with Bill Gates getting unlimited access to the timeshare terminal at age 13. It's as if you were interested in the fashion in your neighbor when you were growing up and happens to be Giorgio Armani. And when was Jobs born? Steve Jobs, February 24th, 1955. Another one of the pioneers of the software revolution was Eric Schmidt. He ran Novell, one of Silicon Valley's most important software firms, and in 2001 he became the chief executive officer of Google. Birth date: Eric Schmidt, April 27, 1955. I don't mean to suggest, of course, that every software tycoon in the Silicon Valley was born in 1955. Some weren't, just as not as every business titan in the United States was born in the mid-1830s. But there are very clearly patterns here, and what's striking is how little we seem to want to acknowledge them. But we pretend the success is exclusively a matter of individual merit. But there's nothing in any of the histories we've looked at so far that suggests things are that simple. There are stories instead about people who were given a special opportunity to work really hard and seized it, and to come who had to come of age at a time when the extraordinary effort was rewarded by the rest of the society. Their success was not just of their own making, it was a product of the world in which they grew up. By the way, let's not forget Bill Joy. Had he been just a little bit older and had to face the drudgery of programming with computer cards, he says he would have studied science. Bill Joy, the computer legend, would have been Bill Joy, the biologist, and had he come along a few years later, the little window that gave him a chance to write the supporting code for the internet would have closed. Again, Bill Joy, the computer legend, might as well have been Bill Joy, the biologist. When was Bill Joy born? November 8th, 1954. Joy would go on, after his stint at Berkeley, to become one of the four founders of Sun Microsystems, one of the oldest and most important of Silicon Valley's software companies. And if you still think that accidents of time and place and birth don't matter all that much, here are the birthdays of three other founders of Sun Microsystems: Scott McNealy, November 13, 1954; Vinod Khosla, January 28th, 1955; Andy Becht-Tolshim, September 30th, 1955. Chapter 3: The Troubled Geniuses. Part 1. Knowledge of a boy's IQ is of little help if you are faced with a form full of clever boys. What? In the fifth episode of the 2008 season, the American television quiz show 1 vs. 100 had as a special guest a man named Christopher Langan. The television show 1 vs. 100 is one of the many that sprang in the wake of the phenomenal success of Who Wants to Be a Billionaire. It features a permanent gallery of 100 ordinary people who serve as what is called the mob. Each week they match wits with a special invited guest. At the stake in $1 million. The guest has to be smart enough to answer more questions correctly than his or her 100 adversaries, and by the standard few have ever seemed as superbly qualified as Christopher Langan. Tonight the mob takes on their fiercest competition yet. The voiceover began. Meet Chris Langan, who many call the smartest man in America. The camera did a show pan of a stocky, muscular man in his 50s. The average person has an IQ of 100, the voiceover continued. Einstein 150. Chris has an IQ of 195. He's currently wrapping his big brain around a theory of the universe. But will his king-sized cranium be enough to take down the mob for $1 million? Find out right now on 1 versus 100. R strode Langan onto the stage amid wild applause. You don't think you need to have a high intellect to do well on 1 versus 100, do you? The show's host, Bob Saget, asked him. Saget looked at Langan oddly, as if he were some kind of laboratory specimen. Actually, I think it could be a hindrance, Langan replied. He had a deep, certain voice, to have a high IQ. You tend to specialize, think deep thoughts, you avoid trivia, but now that I see these people, he glanced at the mob, the amusement in his eyes betraying just how ridiculous he found the proceedings, I think I'll do okay. Over the past decade, Chris Langan has achieved a strange kind of fame. He had become the public face, a genius in American life, a celebrity outlier. He gets invited on news shows and profiled in magazines, and he has been the subject of a documentary by the filmmaker Errol Morris, all because of the brain that appears to defy description. The television news show 2020 once hired a neuropsychologist to give Langan an IQ test and Langen's score was literally off the charts, too high to be accurately measured. Another time, Langen took an IQ test especially designed for people too smart for ordinary IQ tests. He got all the questions right except one. He was speaking at 6 months of age. When he was 3, he would listen to the radio on Sundays as the announcer read the comics aloud, and he would follow along on his own until he taught himself to read. At 5, he began questioning his grandfather about the existence of God, and remembers being disappointed in the answers he got. In school, Langan could walk into a test in a foreign language class, not having studied at all, and if there were 2 or 3 minutes before the instructor arrived, he could skim through the textbook and ace the test. In his early teenage years, while working as a farmhand, he started to read widely in the area of theoretical physics. At 16, he made his way through Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead's famously abstruse masterpiece, Principia Mathematica. He got a perfect score on his SAT, even though he fell asleep at one point during the test. He did math for an hour, his brother Mark says of Langan's summer routine in high school. Then he did French for an hour. Then he studied Russian. Then he would read philosophy. He did that religiously every day. Another of his brothers, Jeff, says, when Christopher was 14 or 15, he would draw things just as a joke. It would be like a photograph. When he was 15, he could match Jimi Hendrix lick for lick on a guitar. Boom, boom, boom. Half the time, Christopher didn't attend school at all. He would just show up for the tests, and there was nothing they could do about it. To use it was hilarious. He could brief a semester's worth of textbooks in 2 days and take care of whatever he had to take care of, and then get back to whatever he was doing in the first place. On the set of 1 vs. 100, Langan was poised and confident. His voice was so deep, his eyes were small and fiercely bright. He did not circle about topics, searching for the right phrase, or double back to restate a previous sentence. For that matter, he did not say or ah, or use any form of conventional mitigation. His sentences came marching out, one after another, polished and crisp, like soldiers on a parade ground. Every question Saget threw at him, he tossed aside as if it were triviality. When his winnings resulted in $250,000, he appeared to make mental calculations that the risks of losing everything were at the point greater than the potential benefits of staying in. Abruptly, he stopped and said, I'll take the cash, he said. He shook Saget's hand family and was finished, exiting on top as we like to think geniuses invariably do. Just after the First World War, Louis Terman, a young professor of psychology at Stanford University, met a remarkable boy named Henry Cowell. Cowell had been raised in poverty and chaos. Because he did not get along with other children, he had been underschooled since the age of 7. He worked as a janitor at a one-room schoolhouse not far from Stanford campus throughout the day. Cowell would sneak away from his job and play the school piano. And the music he made was beautiful. Terman's specialty was intelligence testing, the standard IQ test that millions of people around the world would take during the following 50 years. Stanford Benet was his creation, so he decided to test Cowell's IQ. The boy must be intelligent, he reasoned, and sure enough, he was. He had an IQ of above 140, which is near genius level. Turbin was fascinated. How many other diamonds in the rough were there, he wondered. He began to look for others. He found a girl who knew the alphabet at 19 months and another
who was reading Dickens and Shakespeare by the time she was 4. He found a young man who had been kicked out of law school because his professors did not believe that it was possible for a human being to precisely reproduce long passages of legal opinions from memory. 1921, Terman decided to make a study of the gifted his life work. Armed with a large grant from the Commonwealth Foundation, he built together a team of field workers and sent them out into California's elementary schools. Teachers were asked to nominate the brightest students in their classes. Those children were given an intelligence test. The students who scored in the top 10% were then given a second IQ test. Those who scored above 130 on that test were given a third IQ test. And from that set of results, Terman selected the best and the brightest. By the time Terman was finished, he had sorted the school students and identified 1470 children whose IQs averaged over 140 and ranged as high as 200. That group of young geniuses came to be known as the termites, and they were the subjects of what would become one of the most famous psychological studies in history. For the rest of his life, Terman watched over his charges like a mother hen. They were tracked and tested, measured and analyzed. Their educational attainments were noted, marriages followed illnesses, tabulated, psychological health charted, and every promotion and job change dutifully recorded. Turner wrote his recruits letters of recommendations for jobs and graduate school applications. He doled out a constant stream of advice and counsel, all the time recording his findings in thick red volumes entitled Genetic Studies of Genius.
There is nothing about an individual as important as his IQ, except possibly his morals, Terman once said. It was those with a very high IQ, he believed, that we must look for production of leaders who advance science, arts, government, education, and social welfare generally. As his subjects grew older, Terman issued updates on their progress, chronicling their extraordinary achievements. It is almost impossible, Ehrman wrote giddily, when his charges were in high school, to read a newspaper account of any sort of competition or activity in which California boys and girls participate, though finding among winners the names of one or more members of our gifted group. He took writing samples from some of his most artistically minded subjects and had literary critics compare them to early writings of famous authors. They could find no difference. All the signs pointed, he said, to a group with the potential for heroic stature. Terman believed that his termites were destined to be the future elite of the United States. Today, many of Terman's ideas remain central to what we think about success. Schools have programs for the gifted. Elite universities often require that students take an intelligence test, such as the American Scholastic Aptitude Test for admission. High-tech companies like Google and Microsoft carefully measure the cognitive abilities of prospective employees out of the same belief they are convinced that those at the very top of the IQ scale have the greatest potential. At Microsoft, famously, job applicants are asked a battery of questions designated to test their smarts, including the classic, why are manhole covers round? If you don't know the answer to that question, then you're not smart enough to work at Microsoft. If I had magical powers and offered to raise your IQ by 30 points, you'd say yes, right? You'd assume that would help you get further ahead in the world. And when we hear about someone like Chris Langan, our instinctive response is the same as Terman's instinctive response when he met Harry Cowell almost a century ago. We feel awe. Geniuses are the ultimate outliers. Surely there is nothing that can hold someone like that back. But is that true? So far in Outliers, we've seen the extraordinary achievements is less about talent than it is about opportunity in the chapter. I want to try to dig deeper into why that's the case by looking at the outlier in the purest and most distilled form, the genius. For years, we've taken our cues from people like Terman when it comes to understanding the significance of high intelligence. But as we shall see, Terman made an error. He was wrong about his termites, and had he happened on a young Chris Langan working his way through Principia Mathematica at the age of 16, he would have been wrong about him. For the same reason, Terman didn't understand what a real outlier was, and that's a mistake we continue to make to this day. One of the most widely used intelligence tests is something called Raven's progressive matrices. It requires no language skills or specific body of acquired knowledge. It's a measure of abstract reasoning skills. A typical Raven's test consists of 48 items, each one harder than the one before it. An IQ is calculated based on how many items are answered correctly. Here's a question typical of the sort that is asked on the Ravens.
It's like some big question. Did you get that? I'm guessing most of you did. The correct answer is C, but now try this one. It's kind of a really hard question that comes to the end of the Ravens. The correct answer is A. I have to confess, I couldn't figure this one out, and I'm guessing most of you couldn't either. Chris Langan almost certainly could, however, when he saw that people like Langan are really brilliant. What we mean is that they have a kind of mind that can figure out puzzles like the last question. Over the years, an enormous amount of research has been done in an attempt to determine how a person's performance on an IQ test like the Ravens translates to real life success. People at the bottom of the scale with an IQ below 70 are considered mentally disabled. A score of 100 is average. You probably need to be just above the mark to be able to handle college. To get to succeed in a reasonably competitive graduate program, you probably need an IQ of at least 115 in general. The higher your score, the more education you'll get, the more money you're likely to make, and believe it or not, the longer you'll live. But there's a catch. The relationship between success and IQ works only up to a point. Once someone has reached an IQ somewhere around 120, having additional IQ points doesn't seem to translate into any measurable real-world advantage. It is amply proved that someone with an IQ 170 is more likely to think well than someone whose IQ is 70. British psychologist Liam Hudson has written, and this holds true, where the comparison is much closer between IQs of say 100 and 130, but the relation seems to break down when one is making comparisons between two people, both of whom have IQs which are relatively high, and a mature scientist with an adult IQ of 130 is as likely to win a Nobel Prize as is one whose IQ is 180. What Hudson is saying is that IQ is a lot like height in basketball. Does anyone, does someone who is 5'6" have a realistic chance of playing professional basketball? Not really. You need to be at least 6 foot or 6'1" to play at that level. And all things being equal, it's probably better to be 6'2" than 6'1", and better to be 6'3" than 6'2". Past a certain point, height stops mattering so much. A player who is 6'8" is not automatically better than someone who's 2 inches shorter. Michael Jordan, the greatest player ever, was 6'6" after all. Basketball player only has to be tall enough. And the same is true of intelligence. Intelligence has a threshold. The introduction to the 1 versus 100 episode pointed out that Einstein had an IQ 150, Langan has an IQ of 195. Langan's IQ is 30% higher than Einstein's. That doesn't mean Langan is 30% smarter than Einstein. That's ridiculous. All I can say is that when it comes to thinking about really hard things like physics, they are both clearly smart enough. The idea that IQ has a threshold, I realize, goes against our intuition. We think that, say, Nobel Prize winners in science must have the highest IQ scores imaginable, that they must be kinds of people who got perfect scores on their entrance exams to college, when every scholarship available had such stellar academic records in high school that they were scooped up by the top universities in the country. But take a look at the following lists where the last 25 Americans to win the Nobel Prize in medicine got their undergraduate degrees starting in 2007. Antioch College, Brown University, UC Berkeley, University of Washington, Columbia University, Case Institute of Technology, MIT, Caltech, Harvard University, Hamilton College, Columbia University, University of North Carolina, DePaul University, University of Pennsylvania, University of Minnesota, University of Notre Dame, Johns Hopkins University, Yale University, Union College, Kentucky, University of Illinois, University of Texas, Holy Cross, Amherst College, Gettysburg College, Hunter College. No one will say that this list represents the college choices of the absolute best high school students in America. Yale and Columbia and MIT are on the list, but so are DePaul, Holy Cross, and Gettysburg College. It's a list of good schools. Along the same lines, here are the colleges of the last 25 American Nobel Prize laureates in the chemistry. City of College in New York, City of College of New York, City Stanford University, University of Dayton, Ohio, Rollins College, Florida, MIT, Grinnell College, MIT, McGill University, Georgia Institute of Technology, Ohio Wesleyan University, Rice University, Hope College, Brigham Young University, University of Toronto, University of Nebraska, Dartmouth College, Harvard University, Berea College, Augsburg College, University of Massachusetts, Washington State University, University of Florida, University of California, Riverside, Harvard University. To be a Nobel Prize winner, apparently you have to be smart enough to get into college at least as good as Notre Dame or University of Illinois. That's all. This is a radical idea, isn't it? Suppose that your teenage daughter found out that she had been accepted at two universities, Harvard University and Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Where would you want her to go? I'm guessing Harvard because Harvard is a better school. Its students score a good 10 to 15% higher on their entrance exams. But given what we are learning about intelligence, the idea that schools can be ranked like runners in a race makes no sense. Georgetown students may not be as smart on the absolute scale as students at Harvard, but they are all clearly smart enough, and future Nobel Prize winners come from schools like Georgetown, as well as from schools like Harvard. The psychologist Barry Schwartz recently proposed that elite schools give up their complex admissions process and simply hold a lottery for everyone above the threshold. Put people in two categories, Schwartz says, good enough and not good enough. The one who are good enough to get into the hat to put into the hat, and those who are not good enough to get rejected. Schwartz concedes that his idea has virtually no chance of being accepted, but he's absolutely right. As Hudson writes, and keep in mind that he did research as an elite all-male English boarding school in the 1950s and 1960s, knowledge of a boy's IQ is of little help if you are faced with a form of clever boys. Let me give you an example of that threshold effect in action. The University of Michigan Law School, like many elite U.S. educational institutions, uses a policy of affirmative action when it comes to applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds. Around 10% of the students in Michigan enrolls each fall are members of racial minorities. If the law school did not significantly relax its uh, entry requirements for those students, admitting them with lower undergraduate grades and lower standardized test scores than everyone else, it estimates that the percentage would be less than 30%. Furthermore, if we compare the grades that the minority and non-minority students get in law school, we see that white students do better. That's not surprising. If one group has higher undergraduate grades and test scores than the other, it's almost certainly going to have higher grades in law school as well. This is the one reason the affirmative action programs are so controversial. In fact, an attack of the University of Michigan's affirmative action program recently went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. For many people, it is troubling that an elite educational institution lets in students who are less qualified than their peers. A few years ago, however, the University of Michigan decided to look closely at how the law school minority students had fared after they graduated. How much money did they make? How far up the profession did they go? How satisfied were they with the careers? What kind of social and community contributions did they make? What kind of honors had they won? They looked at everything that could conceivably be an indication of the real world success, and what they found surprised them. We know that our minority students, a lot of them, were doing well, says Richard Lempert, one of the authors of the Michigan study. I think our expectations was that we would find a half or two-thirds full glass that had not done as well as white students, but nonetheless a lot were quite successful. But we were completely surprised when we found that they were doing every bit as well. There was no place we saw any serious discrepancy. What Lempert is saying is that by the only measure that a law school really ought to care about how well its graduates do in the real world, and minority students aren't less qualified. They're just as successful as white students. And why? Because even though the academic credentials of minority students at Michigan aren't as good as those of white students, the quality of students at the law school is high enough that they're still above the threshold. They're smart enough. Knowledge of the law students' test scores is of little help if you are faced with a classroom of clever law students. Let's take the threshold one step further. If intelligence matters only up to a point, then past the point, other things that have nothing to do with intelligence must start with matter more. It's like a basketball again. Once someone is tall enough, then we start to care about speed and court sense and agility and ball handling skills and shooting touch. So what might some of the other things might be? Well, suppose that instead of measuring your IQ, I gave you a totally different kind of test. Write down as many different uses that you can think of for the following objects. A brick, a blanket. This is an example of what's called divergence test, as opposed to tests like Ravens, which asks you to sort through a list of possibilities and converge on the right answer. It requires you to use your imagination and take your mind in as many different directions as possible. With the divergence test, obviously there isn't a single right answer. What the test giver is looking for, the number and uniqueness of your response. And what that test is measuring isn't analytical intelligence, but something profoundly different, something much closer to creativity. Divergence tests are every bit as challenging as convergence tests. And if you don't believe that, I encourage you to pause and try the brick and blanket test right now. Here, for example, are answers to the uses of objects test collected by Liam Hudson from a student named Poole. At the top British school. Brick, to use in a smash and grab raids to help hold the house together, to use in a game of Russian roulette if you want to keep the fit. If you want to keep fit at the same time, bricks at 10 paces, turn and throw, no evasive action allowed. To hold it either down on a bed, tie a brick at each corner as a breaker of empty Coca-Cola bottles. Blanket, to use on a bed as a cover for illicit sex in the woods, as a tent to make smoke signals with, as a sail for the boat cart or sled, as a substitute for towel, as a cover for illicit sex in the woods, as a target for shooting and practice for short-sighted people, as a thing to catch people jumping out of burning skyscrapers, as a cover for illicit sex in the woods. It's not hard to read Poole's answers and get some sense of how his mind works. He's funny, he's a little submersive and libidinous. He has a flair for dramatic. His mind leaps from violent imagery to sex to people jumping out of burning skyscrapers to very practical issues, such as how to get a duvet to stay on the bed. He gives us the impression that if we gave him another 10 minutes, he'd come up with another 20 uses. Now, for the sake of comparison, consider the answers of another student from Hudson's sample. His name is Florence. Hudson tells us Florence is a prodigy with one of the highest IQs in school. Bricks, building things and throwing. Blanket, keeping warm, smothering fire, tying to trees, sleeping in as a hammock, improvised stretcher. Where is Florence's imagination? He identified the most common and most functional uses for bricks and blankets and simply stopped. Florence's IQ is higher than Poole's, but that means little since both students are above the threshold. What is more interesting is that Poole's mind can leap from violent imagery to sex to people jumping out of buildings without missing a beat, and Florence's mind can't. Now, which of these two students do you think is better suited to do these kinds of brilliant imaginative works that wins the Nobel Prize? That's the second reason the Nobel Prize winners come from the Holy Cross as well as Harvard because Harvard isn't selecting its students on a basis of how well they do on the uses of a brick test, and maybe uses of brick is a better predictor of the Nobel Prize ability. It also is the second reason Michigan Law School couldn't find a difference between its affirmative action graduates and the rest of its alumni. Being a successful lawyer is about a lot more than IQ. It involves having a kind of fertile mind that Poole had. And just because Michigan minority students have lower scores on convergence tests doesn't mean they don't have other critical traits in abundance. This was Terman's error. He fell in love with the fact that his termites were the absolute pinnacle of the intellectual scale at 99th percentile, the 99th percentile, without realizing how little that seemingly extraordinary fact meant. By the time the termites reached adulthood, Terman's error was plain to see. Some of his child geniuses had grown up to publish books and scholarly articles and thrive in business. Several ran for public office. There were two Superior Court justices, one municipal court judge, two members of the California state legislature, and one prominent state official. A few of his geniuses were nationally known figures. They tended to earn good incomes, but not that good. The majority had careers that could only be considered ordinary, and a surprising number ended up with careers that even Terman considered failures. Nor were there any Nobel Prize winners in his exhaustively selected group of geniuses. His field workers actually tested two elementary students who went on to be Nobel laureates, William Shockley and Luis Alvarez, and rejected them both. Their IQs weren't high enough. In a devastating critique, the sociologist Petrum Sorokin once showed that if Terman had simply put together a randomly selected group of children from the same kinds of family backgrounds as termites and dispensed with IQs altogether, he would have had ended up with a group doing almost as many impressive things as his painstakingly selected group of geniuses. By no stretch of the imagination or standards of genius, Sorokin concluded, is the gifted group as a whole gifted. By that time, Terman came out with the fourth volume of Genetic Studies of Genius. The word genius had all but vanished. We have seen, Terman concluded, with more than a touch of disappointment, that intellect and achievement are far from perfectly correlated. What I told you at the beginning of this chapter about the extraordinary intelligence of Chris Langan, in other words, is of little use if we want to understand his chances of being a success in the world. Yes, he is a man with a one in a million mind and the ability to get through Principia Mathematica at 16. And yes, his sentences come marching out after one and after another, polished and crisp like soldiers on a parade ground. But so what? If we want to understand the likelihood of his becoming a true outlier, we have to know a lot more about him than that. Chapter 4: The Trouble with Geniuses, Part 2. After protracted negotiations, it was agreed that Robert would be put on probation. Chris Langan's mother was from San Francisco and was estranged from her family. She had four sons, each with a different father. Chris was the eldest. His father disappeared before Chris was born. He's said to have died in Mexico. His mother's second husband was murdered. Her third committed suicide. Her fourth was a failed journalist named Jack Langan. To this day, I haven't met anybody who was as poor when they were kids as our family was, Chris Langan says. We didn't have a pair of match socks. Our shoes had holes in them. Our pants had holes in them. We only had one set of clothes. I remember my brothers and I going into the bathroom and using the bathtub to wash our only set of clothes when we were bare butt naked. Or we were doing that because we didn't have anything to wear. Jack Langan would go on drinking sprees and disappear. He would lock the kitchen cabinet so the boys couldn't get to the food. He was a bullwhip to keep the boys in line. He would get jobs, then lose them, moving the family out to the next town. One summer, the family lived on an Indian reservation in a teepee, subsisting on the government surplus peanut butter and cornmeal. For a time, they lived in Virginia City, Nevada. There was only one law officers in town, and when the Hells Angels came to town, he would crouch down in the back of his office. Mark Langan remembers. There was a bar there. I always remember. It was called the Bucket of Blood Saloon. The boys were in grade school. The family moved to Bozeman, Montana. One of the Chris's spent time in a foster home. Another was sent to reform school. I don't think the school ever understood just how gifted Christopher was, his brother says. He sure as heck didn't play it up. This was Bozeman. It was like it is today. It was a small hick town when we were growing up. We weren't treated well there. They just decided that my family was a bunch of deadbeats. To stick up for himself and his brothers, Chris started to lift weights. One day when Chris was 14, Jack Langa got rough with the boys as he sometimes did, and Chris knocked him out cold. Jack left never to return. Upon graduation from his high school, Chris was offered two full scholarships, one to Reed College in Oregon and the other to the University of Chicago. He chose Reed. What? It was a huge mistake, Chris recalls. I had a case of so culture shock. I was a crew cut kid who had been working as a ranch hand in the summers in Montana. There I was with a whole bunch of long-haired city kids, most of them from New York, and these kids had a whole different style than I'm used to. I couldn't get a word in edgewise at class. They were very inquisitive, asking questions all the time. I was crammed into a dorm room. There were four of us, and the other three guys had a whole different other lifestyle. They were smoking pot. They would bring their girlfriend to the room. I never smoked pot before, so basically I took to hiding in the library. He continued, then I lost that scholarship. My mother was supposed to fill out a parent's financial statement for the renewal of that scholarship. She neglected to do so. She was confused by the requirements or whatever. At some point it came to my attention that my scholarship had been renewed, so I went to the office to ask why, and they told me. Well, no one sent us the financial statement. We allocated all my scholarship money and it's all gone. So I'm afraid that you don't have the scholarship here anymore. That was the style of the place. They simply didn't care. They didn't give a poop about their students. There was no counseling, no mentoring, nothing. Chris left free before the final set of exams, left, leaving him with a row of F's on his transcript in the first semester he had earned. In the first semester, he had earned A's. He went back to Bozeman and worked in the construction as a Forest Service firefighter for a year and a half. Then he enrolled at Montana State University. I was taking math and philosophy classes, he recalled. Then in the winter quarter, I was living 13 miles out of town, out on the Beach Hill Road, and the transmission fell out of my car. My brothers had used it, and when I was gone that summer, they were working for the railroad and had driven it on the railroad tracks. I didn't have the money to repair it, so I went to my advisor and the dean in sequence and said, I have a problem. The transmission fell out of my car and you had have me in the 70:30 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. class. If you could please just transfer me to afternoon section of these classes, I would appreciate it because of this car phone. There was a neighbor who was a rancher who was going to take me in at 11 o'clock. My advisor was this cowboy-looking guy with a handlebar mustache dressed in a tweed jacket. He said, "Well, son, after looking at your transcript at Reed College, I see that you have yet to learn that everyone has to make sacrifices to get education." Request denied. So then I went to the dean. Same treatment. His voice grew tight. He was describing things that had happened more than 30 years ago, but the memory still made him angry. At that point, I realized here I was, knocking myself out to make money to make my way back to school. It's the middle of Montana winter. I want to hitchhike into town every day, do whatever I had to do just to get into school and back, and they're unwilling to do anything for me. So bananas and that was the point I decided I could do without a higher education system. Even I couldn't do without it. It was sufficiently repugnant to me that I wouldn't do it anymore. So I dropped out of college, simple as that. Chris Langan experience at Reed and Montana State represented a turning point in his life. As a child, he had dreamt of becoming an academic. He should have gone to PhD universities, institutions structured and large for people with this kind of deep intellectual interest and curiosities. Once he got into the university environment, I thought he could prosper. I really did, his brother Mark says. I thought he could somehow find a niche. It made absolutely no sense to me when he left that. Without a degree, Lang and floundered. He worked in construction one frigid winter. He worked on a clam boat on Long Island. He took factory jobs and minor civil service positions and eventually became the bouncer in a bar much of his adult years. Though through it all he continued to read deeply into philosophy, mathematics, and physics as he worked on sprawling treatise he calls the CTMU, the Cognitive Theoretical Model of the Universe. Without academic credentials, he despairs of everything published in a scholarly journal. I'm a guy who had a year and a half of college, he says with a shrug. At some point, this will come to my attention that editor, as he's going to take the paper and send it off to the referees, these referees are going to try and look me up and they're not going to find me. And they're going to say, this guy has a year and a half of college. How can he know what he's talking about? It's a heartbreaking story. At one point, I asked Lang hypothetically whether he would take a job at Harvard University if it were offered to him. Well, that's a difficult question, he replied. Obviously, as a full professor at Harvard, I would count. My ideas will have weight, and I could use my position, my affiliation at Harvard to promote my ideas. An institution like that is a great source of intellectual energy, and if I were at a place like that, I could absorb the vibration of the air. It was suddenly clear how lonely his life has been. Here he was, a man with an insatiable appetite for learning, forced for most of his adult life to live in an intellectual isolation. I even noticed the kind of intellectual energy in a year and a half I was in college, he said, almost wistfully. Ideas are in the air constantly. It's such a stimulating place to be. On the other hand, he went on, Harvard is basically a glorified corporation operating with a profit incentive. That's what makes it a tick. It's an endowment in the billions of dollars. The people running it are not necessarily searching for the truth and knowledge. They would be big shots, and when you accept a paycheck from these people, it's going to come down to what you want to do and what you feel is right versus what the man says you can do to receive another paycheck. When you're there, they got a thumb right on you. They're out to make sure you don't step out of line. What does the story Chris Lagan tell us? His explanations, as heartbreaking as they are also a little strange. His mother forgets to sign his financial aid form, and just like that, no scholarship. Tries to move from morning to afternoon class, something students do every day, gets stopped cold. And why were Langan's teachers at Reed and Montana State so indifferent to his plight? Teachers typically delighted in the minds as brilliant as his. Langan talks about dealing with Reed and Montana State as if they were some kind of vast, unyielding government bureaucracy. But colleges, particularly small liberal arts colleges like Reed, tend not to be rigid bureaucracies, making allowances in the name of helping someone stay in the school what professors do all the time. Even in his discussion of Harvard, it's as if Langan has the conception of culture and particulars of the institution he's talking about. When you accept a paycheck from these people, it's going to come down to what you want to do and what you feel is right versus what the man says you can do to receive another paycheck. What? One of the main reasons college professors accept a lower paycheck than they could get in a private industry is that university life gives them the freedom to do what they want to do and what they feel is right. Langan has Harvard backwards. When Langan told me his life story, I couldn't help thinking of the life of Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who famously headed the American effort to develop the nuclear bomb during World War II. Oppenheimer, by all accounts, was a child with a mind very much like Chris Langan's. His parents considered him a genius. one of his students recalled that he received every new idea as perfectly beautiful. He was doing a lab experiences by the third grade and studying physics and chemistry by the fifth grade. When he was 9, he once told one of his cousins, "Ask me a question in Latin and I'll answer you in Greek." Oppenheimer went into Harvard and then on to Cambridge University to pursue a doctorate in physics. There, Oppenheimer, who struggled with depression his entire life, grew despondent. His gift for was for theoretical physics, but his tutor, a man named Patrick Blackett, who would win the Nobel Prize in 1948, was forcing him to attend minutia, the minutia of experimental physics, which he had hated. He grew more and more emotionally unstable, and then in an act still strange to this day, and no one's properly made sense of it, Oppenheimer took some chemicals from the laboratory and tried to poison his tutor. Blackett luckily found out something was amiss. The university was informed, Oppenheimer was called on the carpet, and what happened next is every bit unbelievable as the crime itself. Here is how the incident is described in the American Prometheus, Kai Bird, Martin Shern's biography of Oppenheimer. After protracted negotiations, it was agreed that Robert would be put on probation and have regular sessions with a prominent Harley Street psychiatrist in London. On probation, here we have two very brilliant young students, each of whom runs into a problem that imperils his college career. Lange's mother had missed the deadline for his financial aid. Oppenheimer had tried to poison his tutor. To continue on, they are required to plead their case to authority. And what happens? Lange gets his scholarship taken away, and Oppenheimer gets sent to a psychiatrist. Oppenheimer and Lange might both be geniuses, but in other ways they could not be more different. The story of Oppenheimer's appointment to be scientific director of the Manhattan Project 20 years later is perhaps an even better example of this difference. The general in charge of the Manhattan Project was Leslie Groves, and he sourced the country trying to find the right person to lead the atomic bomb effort. Oppenheimer, by rights, was a long shot. He was just 38 and a junior to many of those people whom he would have to manage. He was a theorist, and his job was and he, and this was his job that called for experimenters and engineers. His political affiliations were dodgy. He had all kinds of friends who were communists. Perhaps more striking, he had never had administrative experience. He was a very impractical fellow. One of Oppenheimer's friends later said he would have about with the scuffed shoes and funny hat, and more important, he didn't know anything about equipment. As one Berkeley scientist puts it more succinctly, he couldn't run a hamburger stand. Oh, and by the way, in graduate school, he tried to kill his tutor. This was a resume of a man who was trying out for what might be said to be, without exaggeration, one of the most important jobs of the 20th century. And what happened? The same thing that happened 20 years earlier at Cambridge. He got the rest of the world to see things his way. Here are birds and Sherwins again. Oppenheimer understood the groves guarded the entrance to the Manhattan Project, and he therefore turned on all his charm, brilliance. It was an irresistible performance. Groves was smitten. He's a genius. Groves later told the reporter, a real genius. Groves was an engineer by training, with a graduate degree from MIT, and Oppenheimer's great insight was to appeal to that side of Groves. Bird and Sherwin go on. Oppenheimer is the first scientist Groves had met on his tour of potential candidates who grasped the building atomic bomb required finding practical solutions to a variety of cross-disciplinary problems. Groves found himself nodding in agreement when Oppenheimer pitched the notion of a central laboratory devoted to this purpose, or as he later testified, we would begin to come to grips with the chemical, metallurgical, engineering, and ordnance problems that had so received no consideration. Would Oppenheimer have lost his scholarship at Reed? Would he have been unable to convince his professors to move his classes afternoon? Of course not. And that's not because he's smarter than Chris Langan. It's because he's possessed the kind of savvy that allowed him to get what he wanted from the world. They required that everyone take introductory calculus, Langan said of his brief stay at Montana State, and I happened to get a guy who taught it in a very dry, very trivial way. I didn't understand why he was teaching it this way, so I asked him questions. I actually had to chase him down to his office. I asked him, "Why are you teaching this way? Why do you consider this practice to be relevant to calculus?" And this guy is a tall, lanky guy, always had sweat stains under his arms. He turned and looked at me and said, "You know, there's something you should probably get straight. Some people just don't have the intellectual firepower to be mathematicians. There they are, the professors and the prodigy. And what the prodigy clearly wants is to be engaged at long last with a mind that loves mathematics as much as he does. But he fails. In fact, this is the most heartbreaking part of it all. He manages to have an entire conversation with his calculus professor, that ever communicating one fact most likely to appeal to a calculus professor. The professor never realizes that Chris Langan is good at calculus. This particular skill that allows you to talk your way out of a murder rap or convince your professor to move you from morning to afternoon section is what psychologist Robert Sternberg calls practical intelligence. To Sternberg, practical intelligence includes things like knowing what to say to whom, knowing when to say it, and knowing how to say it for maximum effect. It is procedural. It is about knowing how to do something without necessarily knowing why you know it or being able to explain it. It's practical, its nature, that it's not knowledge for its own sake. It's knowledge that helps you read situations correctly and get what you want. And critically, it's a kind of intelligence separate from the sort of analytical ability measured by IQ. To use the technical term, general intelligence and practical intelligence are orthogonal. The presence of one doesn't imply the presence of the other. You can have lots of analytical intelligence and very little practical intelligence, or lots of practical intelligence and not much analytical intelligence, or as in lucky case of someone like Robert Oppenheimer, you can have lots of both. So where does something like practical intelligence come from? We know where analytical intelligence comes from. It's something, at least in part, that's in your genes. Chris Langan started talking at 6 months. He taught himself to read 3 years of age. He was born smart. IQ is a measure to some degree of his innate ability, but social savvy is knowledgeable. It's a set of skills that the place where we see to get these kinds of attitudes and skills is from our families. Perhaps the best explanations we have at this process comes from the sociologist Annette Laurie, who a few years ago conducted the fascinating study of a group of third graders. She picked up both blacks and whites and children from both wealthy homes and poor homes, zeroing in ultimately on 12 families. Laurie and her team visited each family at least 20 times for hours at stretch. She and her assistants told her subjects to treat them like a family dog, and they followed them to church and to soccer games, to doctor's appointments with tape recorder in one hand and notebook in the other. You might expect that if you spent so much time with extended period in the 12 different households, what you would gather is 12 different ideas about how to raise children. There would be a strict parents, lax parents, and hyper-involved parents, and the mellow parents, and on and on. What Lario found, however, is something much different. There are only two parenting philosophies, and they divided almost perfectly along class lines. The wealthier parents raised their kids one way, and the poorer parents raised their kids another way. The wealthier parents were heavily involved in their children's free time, shuttling them from one activity to the next, quizzing them about their teachers and coaches and teammates. One of the well-off children one of the well-off children Lario followed played on a baseball team, two soccer teams, a swim team, a basketball team in the summer, as well as playing in an orchestra and taking piano lessons. That kind of intensive scheduling was almost entirely absent from the lives of poor children. Play for them wasn't soccer practice twice a week. It wasn't making up games outside with their siblings and other kids with neighborhood. What a child did was considered by his or her parents as something separate from the adult world and not particularly consequential. One girl from a working class family, Katie Brindle, sang in a choir after school, where she signed up for herself and walked to the choir practice on her own. Leo writes, "What Mrs. Bridle doesn't do that is routine for middle class mothers and view her daughter's interest in singing as a signal to look for other ways to help her develop the interest into formal talent. Similarly, Mrs. Brindle does not discuss Katie's interest in drama or express regret that she cannot afford to cultivate her daughter's talent. Instead, she frames Katie's skills and interests as character traits. Singing and acting are part of what makes Katie Katie. She sees that shows her daughter put on as cute and as a way for Katie to get attention. The middle class parents talk things through with their children, reasoning with them. They didn't just issue commands, they expected the children to talk back to them, to negotiate, to question adults in positions of authority. If their children were doing poorly at school, the wealthier parents challenge their teachers. They intervene on behalf of their kids. One child, Lario, follows, just misses qualifying for the gifted program. Her mother arranges for her to be retested privately, petitions the school, and gets her daughter admitted. The poor parents, by contrast, are intimidated by authority. The poor parents, they react passively and stay in the background. Lario writes uh, of one low-income parent. At a parent-teacher conference, for example, Miss McAllister, who's a high school graduate, seems subdued. The gregarious and outgoing nature she displays at home is hidden in this setting. She sits hunched over in a chair and she keeps her jacket zipped up. She's very quiet. When the teacher reports that Harold has not been turning in his homework, Miss McAllister clearly is flabbergasted, but all she says is, "He did it at home." She does not follow up with the teacher or attempt to intervene on Harold's behalf. Interview is up to the teachers to manage her son's education. That is their job, not hers. Larry calls the middle-class parenting style concerted cultivation. It's an attempt to actively foster and assess a child's talents, opinions, and skills. Poor parents tend to follow, by contrast, as a strategy of accomplishment of natural growth. They see as their responsibility to take care for their children, but to let them grow and develop on their own. Larue stresses that one style isn't morally better than the other. The poorer children were to her mind often better behaved, less whiny, more creative in making use of their own time, and had a well-developed sense of independence. But in practical terms, concerted cultivation has enormous advantages. The heavily scheduled, middle-class child is exposed to a constantly shifting set of experiences. She learns teamwork and how to cope in highly structured settings. She is taught how to interact comfortably with adults and ability to speak up when she needs to. In Larry's words, the middle-class children learn a sense of entitlement. That words, of course, had negative connotations these days, what Larry means is the best sense of the term. They acted as though they had a right to pursue their own individual preferences to actively manage interaction in institutional settings. They appeared comfortable in those settings, and they were open to sharing information and asking for attention. It was a common practice among middle class children to shift the interactions to suit their preferences, and they knew the rules. Even in fourth grade, middle class children appeared to be acting on their own behalf to gain advantages. They made special requests of teachers and doctors to adjust procedures to accommodate their desires. By contrast, the working class and poor children were characterized by an immense emerging distance, distrust, and constraint. They didn't know how to get their way or how to customize, using Larry's wonderful term, whatever environment they were in for the best purposes. In one telling scene, Leo describes a visit to the doctor by Alex Williams, a 9-year-old boy, and his mother Christina. The Williams are wealthy professionals. "Alex, you should be thinking of questions you might want to ask a doctor," Christina says in the car on the way to the doctor's office. "You can ask her anything you want. Don't be shy. You can ask anything." Alex thinks for a minute, then says, "I have some bumps under my arms from my deodorant." Christina, "Really? You mean from your new deodorant?" Alex, "Yes, Christina." "Well, you should ask the doctor." Alex's mother, Larry, writes, is teaching that he has the right to speak up, that even though he's going to be in the room with an older person, an authority figure, it's perfectly all right for him to assert himself. They meet the doctor, a genial man in his early 40s. He tells Alex that he is a 95th percentile in height. Alex then interrupts. "Alex, I'm in the what?" "Doctor, it means that you're taller than more than 94 out of 100 young men, and they're 10 years old." "Alex, I'm not 10. Well, they graphed you at 10. You're 9 years and 10 months. They usually take the closest year to the graph." Look how easily Alex interrupts the doctor. "I'm not 10. That's entitlement." His mother prevents that casual incivility because she wants him to learn to assert himself with people in positions of authority. The doctor turns to Alex. "Well, now, most important question. Do you have any questions you want to ask me before I do your physical?" Alex, only one. "I've been getting some bumps on my arms right around here." Indicates underarm. "Underneath?" "Yeah." "Okay, I'll have to take a look at those when I come in closer to do a checkup, and I'll see what that can do. Do they hurt or itch?" "No, they're just there." "Okay, I'll take a look at those bumps for you." The kind of interaction simply doesn't happen with lower caste children. Larry says they would be quiet and submissive, with eyes turned away. Alex takes charge of the moment, and remembering to raise the question he prepared in advance. He gains the doctor's full attention and focuses it on the issue of him choosing, Larry writes. In his doing, he successfully shifts the balance of power away from adults and toward himself. The transition goes smoothly. Alex is used to being treated with respect. He is seen as special, as a person worthy of adult attention and interest. These are key characteristics of strategy of concerted cultivation. Alex is not showing off during his checkup. He is behaving much as he does with his parents. He reasons, negotiates, and jokes with equal case. It's important to understand where the particular mastery of that moment comes from. It's not genetic. Alex Williams did not inherit the skills to interact with authority figures from his parents and grandparents the way he inherited the color of his eyes, nor is it racial. It's not a specific practice specific to either black or white people. As it turns out, Alex Williams is black and Katie Brittle is white. It's a cultural advantage. Alex has those skills because over the course of his young life, his mother and father, in the manner of educated families, have painstakingly taught them to him, nudging and prodding and encouraging and showing him the rules of the game, writing down that little rehearsal in the car on the way to the doctor's office. When we talk about the advantages of a class, Larry argues, this is a large part of what we mean. Alex Williams is better off than Katie Brindle because he's wealthier and because he goes to a better school, but also because, and perhaps even more critical, the sense of entitlement that he has been taught and the attitude perfectly suited to succeeding in the modern world. This is the advantage that Oppenheimer had and that Chris Langan lacked. Oppenheimer was raised in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Manhattan. Son of an artist, a successful garment manufacturer, his children was the embodiment of concerted cultivation. On weekends, the Oppenheimers would go driving the countryside in the chauffeur-driven Packard. Summers, he would be taken to Europe to see his grandfather. He attended the Ethical Culture School on Central Park West, perhaps the most progressive school in the nation, where his biographers write, students were infused with the notion that they were being groomed to reform the world. When his math teacher realized he was bored, she sent him off to do independent work. As a child, Oppenheimer was passionate about rock collecting. At the age of 12, he began corresponding with local geologists about rock formations he had seen in the Central Park. He had so impressed them that they invited him to give a lecture before the New York Mineralogical Club. As Sherwin and Bird write, Oppenheimer's parents responded to their son's hobby an almost textbook example of concerted cultivation. Dreading the thought of having to talk to an audience of adults, Robert begged his father to explain that they had invited a 12-year-old. Greatly amused, Julius encouraged his son to accept the honor. On the designated evening, Robert showed up to the club with his parents who proudly introduced their son as J. Robert Oppenheimer. The startled audience, a geologist and amateur rock collectors, burst out laughing when he stepped on the podium, when a box had to be found for him to stand on so the audience could see more of the shock of his wildly black hair sticking up above the lectern. Shy and awkward, Robert nevertheless read his prepared remarks and was given a hearty round of applause. Is it any wonder Oppenheimer handled the challenge of his life so brilliantly? If you are someone whose father had made his way up his business world, then you see firsthand what it means to negotiate your way out of a tight spot. If you're someone who has sent to an ethical culture school, then you aren't going to be intimidated by the royal Cambridge dons arrayed in judgment against you. If you study physics at Harvard, then you know how to talk to an army general who did engineering just down the road at MIT. Chris Langan, by contrast, had only the bleakness of Bozeman and a home dominated by an angry junker stepfather, Jack Langan. Did this to all of us, said Mark. We all had true resentment of authority. That was the lesson Langan learned. In his childhood, distrust authority and should be independent. Never had a parent teach him on the way to the doctor how to speak up for himself or how to reason and negotiate with those in positions of authority. He didn't learn entitlement. He learned get straight. It may seem like a small thing, but it wasn't a crippling handicap in navigating the world beyond on Bozeman. I couldn't get any financial aid either, Mark went on. We just had zero knowledge, less than zero knowledge of the process, how to apply the forms, checkbooks, it was not our environment. If Christopher had been born in a wealthy family, if he was the son of a doctor who was well connected in the some major market, I guarantee you he would have been at 17. He would have been one of those guys you read about knocking back PhDs at 17. His brother Jeff says, it's a culture you find yourself in that determines that. The issues with Chris is that he was always too bored to actually sit there and listen to his teachers. If someone had recognized his intelligence and he was from a family where there was some kind of value in education, they would have made sure he wasn't bored. When the termites were into their adulthood, Terman looked at the records of the 730 of the men and divided them into three groups. 150, the top 20% fell into what Terman called the A group. They were true success stories, the stars, the lawyers, the physicians, and engineers and academics. 90% of the A's graduated from college, and among them had earned 98 graduate degrees. The middle 60% were the B group, those who were doing satisfactorily. The bottom 150 were the C's, the ones who Terman just have done the least with their superior mental ability. They were postal workers and struggling bookkeepers, and the men lying on their couches at home without any job at all. One third of the C's were college dropouts, a quarter only had a high school diploma, and all 150 of the C's, each one of whom at one point in his life had been dubbed a genius, had together earned a grand total of 8 graduate degrees. What was the difference between A's and the C's? Terman ran through every conceivable explanations. He looked at their physical and mental health, the masculinity, femininity scores, and their hobbies and vocational interests. He compared the ages when they started walking and talking, what their precise IQ scores were in elementary and high school, and in the end, only one thing mattered: family background. The as overwhelmingly came from middle of the upper class, their homes were filled with books. Half of the fathers of the A group had a college degree or beyond. That this at the time when the university education was a rarity. The C's, on the other hand, were from the other side of the tracks. Almost a third of them had a parent who had dropped out of school before the eighth grade. At one point, Terman had his field workers go and visit everyone from A to C groups and rate their personalities and manner. What they found is everything you expect to find if you were comparing children raised in an atmosphere of concerted cultivation with children raised in an atmosphere of natural growth. The as the children raised in an atmosphere of natural growth, the as were judged to be much more alert, poised, attractive, and well dressed. Oh, A's. In fact, its scores on those four dimensions are so different as to make you think you are looking at two different species of humans. You aren't, of course. You're simply seeing the difference between those schooled by their families to present their best face to the world and those denied that experience. The terminal results are deeply distressing. Let's not forget how highly gifted the C group was. If you had met them at 5 or 6 years of age, you would have been overwhelmed by their curiosity and mental agility and sparkle. They were true outliers. The plain truth of the term study, however, is that in the end, almost none of the genius children from the low social economic class ended up making a name for themselves. What did the C's lack, though? Not something expensive or impossible to find, not something encoded in DNA or hardwired into the circuits of their brains. They lacked something that could have been given to them if we'd only known they needed it, a community around them that prepared them properly for the world. The C's were squandered talent, but they didn't need to be. Today, Chris Langan lives in rural Missouri on a horse farm. He moved there a few years ago after he got married. He's in his 50s but looks many years younger. He has build of a linebacker, thick through the chest with enormous biceps. His hair is combed straight back of his forehead. He has a neat graying mustache and aviator-style glasses. If you look into his eyes, you can see the intelligence burning behind him. A typical day is, I get up and make coffee. I go in and sit in the front of the computer and begin working on whatever I was working on the night before. Told me not long ago. I find if I go to bed with a question on my mind, all I have to do is concentrate on the question before I go to sleep, and I virtually always have the answer in the morning. Sometimes I realize what the answer is because I dreamed the answer and I can remember it. Other times I just feel the answer and I start typing and the answer emerges onto the page. He had just been reading the work of the linguist Noam Chomsky. There were piles of books in his study. He ordered books from the library all the time. I always feel that the closer you get to the original sources, the better off you are, he said. Langan seemed content. He had farm animals to take care of and books to read and a wife he loved. It was a much better life than being a bouncer. I don't think there's anyone smarter than me out there, he went on. I've never met anybody like me or never seen even an indication that there's somebody who actually has better powers of comprehension. Never seen it, and I don't think I'm going to. I could, my mind is open to the possibility. If anyone should challenge me, oh, I think that I am smarter than you are. I think I could have but what he said sounded boastful, but it wasn't really. It was the opposite, a touch defensive. He'd been working for decades now on a project of enormous sophistication, but was none of what he had done had ever been published, much less read by the physicists and philosophers and mathematicians who might be able to judge its value. Here he was, a man with one in a million mind, and he had yet to have any impact in the world. He wasn't holding forth academic conferences, he wasn't leading the graduate seminar at some prestigious university, he was living on a slightly tumble-down horse farms in northern Missouri, sitting on a back porch in jeans and cut-off t-shirts. He knew how it looked. It was a great paradox of Chris Langan's genius. I've not pursued mainstream publishers as hard as I should have, he conceded, going around querying publishers trying to find an agent. I haven't done it, and I'm not interested in doing it. It was an admission of defeat. Every experience he had outside of his mind had ended in frustration. He knew he needed to do a better job in navigating the world, but he didn't know how. He couldn't even talk to his calculus teacher for goodness sake. These were things that others with lesser minds could master easily. But that's because those others had help along the way, and Chris Langan never had. It wasn't an excuse, it was a fact. He had to make his way alone, and no one, not rock stars, not professional athletes, not software billionaires, and not even geniuses ever makes it alone. Chapter 5: The Three Lessons of Joe Flom. Section 1: Joe Flom is the last living named partner of the prestigious law firm Skadden, Arp Slate, Meagher and Flom. The son of Jewish immigrants, he grew up extremely poor in the Great Depression after attending Harvard Law School, being named to the Law Review, an honor reserved for the top students. He had difficulty finding a job, was finally hired as an associate by Marshall Skadden and Leslie Arps. In 1954, after Flom took over as managing partner, the firm began to grow quickly. It now has nearly 2,000 lawyers and 23 offices around the world. Section 2: Joe Flom's story seems like a typical rags to riches story of someone overcoming adversity, but once again, Gladwell says it's worth investigating where Joe Flom came from. Flom's challenges growing up poor, being Jewish at a time when Jews were discriminated against, and growing up in the Great Depression were actually advantages, according to Gladwell. The lessons of Joe Flom's life, he claims, makes it possible to predict the background, age, and origin of New York's most powerful attorneys without knowing any other fact about them. Section 3: Lesson Number 1: The Importance of Being Jewish. Alexander Bickel, one of Joe Flom's classmates at Harvard, was also born to Eastern European Jewish immigrants and earned a Harvard law degree. The first firm he applied to told him that he could not hire someone with his antecedents, a lawyer not of a desired background, religion, or social class in the 1940s and 1950s had to go work in a smaller upstart firm. The cases such firms handled were those of larger firms did not want. Section 4: In Flom's days, Wall Street law firms represented a large corporations and dealt mainly with taxes and legal aspects of issuing stocks and bonds. They did not do litigation and rarely had divisions set aside for defending or filing lawsuits. That era, corporations rarely sued each other or orchestrated hostile takeovers. It was seen as uncivilized. Much of the work that fell to smaller firms handled consisted of litigation and proxy fights, a type of maneuver used in hostile corporate takeover bids. Joe Flams excelled at proxy fights and was even called in by larger firms for advice. In the 1970s, federal regulations were relaxed, investors became more aggressive, and companies began to take legal action against one another. By the end of the 1980s, the amount of money involved in mergers and acquisitions every year on Wall Street had increased to 2,000%. Joe Flom's experience is like that of Bill Joy and Bill Gates, who spent all of their free time engaged in obscure hobby but were rewarded when personal computers were released. Joe Flom has spent a majority of his legal career working cases no one wanted, but he was later rewarded when those types of cases became the most lucrative. Section 5. Lesson number 2: Demographic Luck. Maurice Janklow, the eldest son of Jewish immigrants, started law school in 1990. While he was intelligent, well educated, and his family was fairly successful, he did not meet with notable success. His son, Mort Jotwell, however, was very successful. After selling an early cable television franchise, Mort Janklow created one of the most prestigious literary agencies in the world. Gladwell proposes that the difference in success between two generations of Jonklows is a function of the different eras. Section 6. There's another way to break down the data for Terman's genius. Termites born between 1903 and 1911 versus those born between 1912 and 1917. Far more of Terman's failures are in the first group. Although parents' occupations and values matter, birth area is just as important. Those born in the first group graduated college during the height of the Great Depression and would have had to interrupt their careers if drafted for World War II. The second group graduated college after the worst depression had passed, and if they survived World War II, would have been young enough to pursue careers. The same logic applies to Maurice and Mort Jonklow. Maurice Jonklow was born in 1902, was economically and psychologically crushed by the Depression. Later in life, he survived by doing the paperwork for real estate deals. Section 7. By contrast, Mort Jonklow was born in the 1930s during the demographic trough. His generation was much smaller than ones before and after. Consequently, more Jonklo had smaller class sizes in school and less competition when applying to university. For an aspiring lawyer, being born in the early 1930s was the same as being born in 1955. Was for software programmers in 1835 was for entrepreneurs. More Jonklo described the events that his father endured, the 1918 flu epidemic, two world wars, and the Great Depression. His father would have been more successful in a different kind of world. Section 8. Lessons number 3. The garment industry and meaningful work. Louis and Regina Bornich left Hamburg, Germany for America in 1889. They were descendants of the Eastern European Jews seeking economic opportunity in New York City with the rise of clothing stores. Louis noticed that none of the stores offered aprons for little girls. He decided to purchase a large volume of cloth so he and his wife could make aprons in their apartment. Section 9. Like many Jewish immigrants at the time, both Louis and his wife had worked in the clothing trade before moving to America. New York City became the most prominent city in clothing manufacturing in the world, and by 1900, the city's garment industry was almost entirely controlled by Eastern Europeans. Arriving in New York City in the 1890s with a background in clothing manufacturing was a stroke of extremely good fortune. Section 10. Louis Borgknecht used the money from the first 40 aprons to buy enough cloth to make 120 aprons, sold out in 2 days. He and Regina hired employees and purchased more sewing machines. By 1892, they had 20 people working for them. By 1913, New York has home to approximately 16,000 garment manufacturing businesses. Louis eventually started making girls' dresses as well, trying to create a product that was affordable and popular. Since there was little competition, as Lewis was expanding his business, he was learning manufacturing, market research, and negotiation skills. This was excellent training for advancement. Compared to the limited knowledge most immigrants at the time could acquire working as day laborers. While the work was difficult, Lewis had also a job that supplied autonomy, complexity, and connection between effort and reward, the most important qualities to make work satisfying. It was meaningful work, much like the hours Bill Gates spent programming or the Beatles spent in Hamburg. It was also very impactful to the children that grew up in homes where their parents engaged in meaningful work. Section 11. In 1982, Louis Farquhar, a sociology graduate student, studied the descendants of people like the Borjniks, Jewish immigrants at the turn of the century. One representative family tree shows the Taylor garment maker, the first generation of garment makers, and the second and lawyers in the third. In another family tree, a leather tanner is followed by a bag manufacturers who are followed by doctors and lawyers. Third tree starts with a small grocer and ends up with 7 doctors, 3 lawyers, and psychologists. Section 12. According to Gladwell, a Jewish lawyer in New York would ideally be born in 1930 to parents who did meaningful work. The greatest rival to Joe Flom's firm, the firm's The firm Watchdale, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz is one of the finest in the world. No firm of its size has made more money over the past 2 decades. The 4 founding members were Herbert Watchdale, born in 1941 to a Jewish immigrant clothing worker; Martin Lipton, born in 1931 to a Jewish immigrant factory manager; Leonard Rosen, born in 1930 to Jewish immigrants who worked in the garment district; and George Katz, born in 1931 to Jewish immigrants whose parents were in the garment trade. Instead of obstacles, the culture and generation of these men were opportunities. Analysis. Chapter 5. The 3 Lessons of Joe Flom. Challenges may build the solid background required for success. Gladwell continues to reinforce the notion that talent and intelligence are not only indicators of success. High-achieving individuals need the right background. With Joe Flom, Gladwell appears to disprove his own argument. He points out the irony that Flom's apparent disadvantages, including poverty and discrimination, contributed to his success. He accepted a position with an upstart firm that has grown to a billion-dollar business. Gladwell even drives the narrative with some foreshadowing, stating that with Flom as a model, we can likely predict the family background, age, and origin of other top New York attorneys. He goes on to dispel the notion of individual accomplishment. With the story of Watchdale, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz, Gladwell shows how founding partners check off all criteria for a perfect lawyer: smart, ambitious, hardworking, born at a time from the right background outsiders, with parents who found meaningful work in the garment industry. For Gladwell, the irony of these attorneys who were unacceptable to elite law firms, rising to the pinnacle of success proves a pattern and reinforces his definition of an outlier. Challenges may be perfect opportunities. Being an outsider may ironically provide a type of luck that leads to success. Gladwell introduces Alexander Bickle and compares him to his law school classmate, Joe Flom. The two attorneys share a similar background, and Bickle also doesn't fit with the high-end law firms of the time. In spite of Bickle's proven legal talents, the fancy law firms wouldn't hire him because of his antecedents, a euphemism for his Eastern European heritage. Gladwell foreshadows the outlier status of both Flom and Bickle, revealing that opportunities hidden in their setbacks. Gladwell expands on his setbacks to opportunities notion with a bit of legal history. Lawyers like Flom, who once had to take any case that came through the door, had years of practice in cases other firms were not equipped to handle. Gladwell compares Flom to Bill Joy and Bill Gates. They all had talent and put in practice and time, so when the right moment struck, they were ready. Unlike Joy and Gates, Flom was a disadvantage because of the discrimination. However, because of his difficulties, Flom was in a perfect position to succeed. The pure luck of a birthday can give an individual a better chance of success. God will tie together two previous elements, termites and birthdays. The less successful termites tended to be born between 1903 and 1911, while the more successful members of the group tended to be born between 1912 and 1917. Gladwell shows that there aren't magic numbers, but impacts of the Great Depression and World War II. He applies the same metric to Janklows to explain more success, Maurice's struggle. Like the industrialist born in the 1830s, the computer programmers born in the mid-1950s, and the Canadian hockey players born from January through March, Gladwell suggests that there's an ideal time for the birth of a highly successful Jewish lawyer from New York. Demographics play a vital role in the opportunity for people to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Being born in a demographic trough generation that's smaller than the ones before and after puts a person in a better position to achieve. Children of these smaller generations experience advantages from birth. For example, hospitals and classrooms are less crowded, and they face less competition for college admissions than job offers. Godwell proves his argument using Janklows and successful litigator Ted Friedman as examples. He reinforces it by noting prime years for lawyers, programmers, and entrepreneurs to be born. Talent, intelligence, and family background impact success, so can being born at the right time. The value of meaningful work drives success for generations. Gladwell introduces immigrants Louis and Regina Borchardt that brought their garment industry expertise from Europe and used it to turn challenge into opportunity. Gladwell states that his struggle transformed into good fortune and continues the next generation as these garment workers share critical lessons for success with their children. Gladwell uses Borchardt to demonstrate the idea of meaningful work that offers autonomy, complexity, and connection between effort and reward. Through Louis Bourgeois may not be a household name like Bill Gates or the Beatles, he shared similar exhaustion and satisfaction from the work he loved. Gladwell talks about the garment industry as a miracle, not only because of the opportunity provided for these recent immigrants, also for the lessons offered their children. Achievement comes from using intelligence and imagination to create work that has meaning. Chapter 6. Harlan, Kentucky. Section 1. The town of Harlan is located in southeastern Kentucky, at the section of the Appalachian Mountains known as the Cumberland Plateau. It was usually founded in 1819 by immigrants from the British Isles. Throughout the 19th century, two Harlan families, the Howards and the Turners, fought regularly, often killing one another. Section 2. The Howards and Turners were not only families killing one another in Appalachia at the time. Other notable examples include the famous Hatfields-McCoy feud, the French Eversole feud, and the Martin-Tolliver feud, which ended with 100 fighting a 2-hour gun battle. Over a 50-year period, there were 1,000 murder indictments in the circuit court clerk's office for a single Cumberland Plateau town. The reason for the pattern of violence is a culture of honor in the mountainous regions. There where farming is not possible, economies revolve around livestock herding. Because theft of livestock can be ruinous, the herdsmen learn to be aggressive and to follow through threats over time. Reputation becomes increasingly important. Much of Appalachia was settled by Scottish Irish immigrants, herdsmen from violent region who reproduced their culture in America. In such a culture, they are far more murderous, especially by an individual who knew the victim, but fewer property crimes. Section 3. The 1990s, University of Michigan psychologists Dove Cohen and Richard Nesbitt conducted an experiment on the culture of honor. Students were asked to fill a questionnaire and turn it in at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The control group filled out the questionnaire and left, but students in the other group were blocked by individual looking through file drawers. When a student tried to pass the individual who was a part of the experiment, who would bump the student on the shoulder and mutter,
butthole. Following the encounter, experiencers gauge the firmness of the students' handshakes, measure the levels of contortions and testosterone, recorded their reaction to the incomplete story about a male student trying to kiss another male student's girlfriend. Cohen and Nesbitt found out the key variable in how strongly students reacted to being blocked and insulted in the hallway was geographic and region. The ones with the strongest reactions were predominantly from the South. Section 4. Gladwell points out that students were not herdsmen, not even children of herdsmen. Cultural legacies are passed down much like accents, even after environments that produce them have been left behind. While upbringing and opportunities shape one's success, the traditions and attitudes one inherits also plays a role. Chapter 6. Analysis. Culture and heritage have an effect on the individuals, even generations removed from the place of origin. Setting a scene in Harlan, Kentucky, Gladwell introduces two of the town's founding families, the Howards and the Turners. He notes that these feuding families and others like them were the rule, not the exception in Appalachia. He explains that these feuds were part of a culture of honor, a term coined by sociologists once again. God will turn to psychological study to show the impact of background on present actions. He details a 1990 study on the culture of honor and showed students from the South reacting more aggressively to an insult than those from the North. He reiterates the strength of the cultural legacy long after the economic, social, and demographic elements behind it have passed. Guidewell reviews the elements of the success, then poses the question to the setup in the rest of the book. Can we learn something about why people succeed and how to make people better about why they take cultural legacy seriously, where their families come from significantly impacts how individuals navigate the world around them. Chapter 7. The Ethnic Theory of Plane Clashes. Section 1. Gladwell describes the 1997 crash of Korean Air Flight 801. The pilot was experiencing good health. The aircraft was in perfect working order. As the flight approached Guam, the ground proximity warning system alerted the pilot that the plane was within 500 feet of the ground. Unable to see the runway in the rain, the first officer suggested aborting the landing and circling around for another attempt. The captain, however, was slow to respond. Before the plane could ever recover altitude, it hit the side of the nearby Nimitz Hill, killing 228 of the 254 passengers. In 20 years prior to the crash, Korean Air lost at least six other planes. Compared to United Airlines from 1988 to 1998, the loss rate for the Korean Air was 17 times higher in April of 1999. Delta Airlines and Air France suspended their partnership with the Korean Air over safety concerns. Shortly after, the Korean Air's record changed completely. Since 1999, they have had a spotless safety record. Gladwell states that the understanding the crash of Flight 801 requires a look of flight records, weather patterns, and the conversation captured by the cockpit voice recorder. What saved Korean Air, according to Gladwell, is a willingness to reckon with the cultural legacy. Section 3. Plane crashes usually result in accumulation of many small errors, typically errors of teamwork, communication, or both, rather than the catastrophic malfunction. One example studied in flight school is the 1990 crash of the Colombian airliner Avianca Flight 052 waiting to land at New York's Kennedy Airport. The flight was forced to circle for over an hour. Since the autopilot was malfunctioned, the captain had to land the plane manually. After the windshield problem the first attempt, the captain tried to go around, but the plane ran out of fuel and crashed. Section 4. Surin Ratawat, a veteran pilot and an expert of the role of human factors in crashes, notes that the Avianca pilot was tired and could have asked to be rerouted. The co-pilot was completely absent from the cockpit transcript, despite being responsible for all communication with the air traffic control. He does tell ATC that he thinks the plane is low on fuel, but apparently he and the pilot mistakenly interpret the ATC reply that they are cleared for the Kennedy Airport to mean that they are moved to the front of the landing queue, where in fact they are merely added to it. Section 5. The relative silence in the cockpit is unusual. Ratswat describes having to land a plane in Helsinki short in its destination due to passenger's medical emergency. His plane is over maximum landing weight due to fuel, and he was unfamiliar with the airport while preparing to land. Ratswat constantly communicated with Helsinki ATC, his co-pilot, two doctors aboard in the plane, other members of his flight crew, and they were encouraging and calming as they shared information as clearly as possible with each other. Section 6. In Avianca 052 flight transcript, right after the aborted first landing plan attempt, the captain orders the co-pilot to tell the ATC they're in an emergency. The co-pilot calmly informs ATC of a change in heading and adds the information about the fuel almost as an afterthought. He says nothing about the emergency, and an air traffic controller who handled the flight remarks on a lack of urgency in his voice. Section 7. The co-pilot used
what linguists call mitigated speech, polite and differential. Two linguistics, Ut Fischer and Judant Orasno, used a hypothetical scenario to identify six different levels of mitigated speech between airplane crew members, ranging from direct command, no mitigation, down to merely hinting at a problem, without any suggested course of action. Fisher and Orasanu found that captains regularly use commands when addressing their co-pilots, but co-pilots often spoke in hints to the pilots, their superiors. Another transcript from the 1982 crash, the co-pilot mentions three times that the wings are covered in ice, but his speech is all hints. The pilot ignores the information and takes off. The plane plunges into the Potomac River moments later. Since the late 1990s, great efforts have been made to combat mitigation in commercial aviation. Subordinate crew members are even gifted scripted statements to use like Captain, I'm concerned about, or Captain, I'm uncomfortable with. Reduced mitigation is the main reason for the decrease in airline accidents in recent years. Section 8. As Avianca Flight 052 turns away from the airport to try another pass, the captain asks the co-pilot if he has informed ATC of their emergency. The co-pilot makes another mitigated statement to the ATC, still not using the word emergency. ATC is specifically asked if the plane is okay with the fuel. The co-pilot responds, I guess so. Minutes later, the engine fails and the plane crashes. Section 9. Ratwad explains that New York controllers handle high traffic volume under stressful conditions and often come off as rude. They will snap at the flight crews, expecting that in an emergency. The flight crews will snap back. The Avianca pilot and co-pilot were intimidated. They should have clearly said they could not comply with the controller's request and needed to land immediately. God will suggest that their failure to do so has something to do with the fact that both pilots were Colombian. Section 10. While working for IBM in Europe, Geert Hofstede, a Dutch psychologist, developed a database that analyzed cultural differences. Hofstede's dimensions rate countries using various measurement scales such as individualism, collectivism, and uncertainty avoidance. Power distance index, one of the scales most relevant to plane crashes, indicate how likely individuals from a given country are to push back against authority. The United States PEI is very low, while Colombia's is very high. A low PEI means more likely to push back against authority, while a high PEI means less likely. On Avianca Flight 052, American co-pilot would probably have been more likely to argue with the ATC or even the pilot. The Colombian co-pilot was less likely to assume the burden of resolving the crisis and more likely to adopt a role of subordinate and speak in with the controller. His mitigated phrasing made ATC think that there was no serious problem. The second PDI country in the world after Brazil is South Korea. Section 11. Malcolm Brenner, a leading investigator with the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board (NTSB), was part of the team that reviewed the Korean Air 801 crash. Because of the equipment outrage of the airport, the crew needed to land plane visually. After using the airport's VOR beacon, a radius between blah, 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 to get within visual range, Guam's UOR beacon is located on Nimitz Hill, not an actual airport, but the pilot knew this and even mentioned it in the pre-flight briefing. He did not, however, have a backup plan. As he approached Guam, he was very tired. Section 12. At the time of the South Korean flight crew culture, the pilot was in complete command and everyone else was highly deferential. Junior officers might buy the captain gifts, and it would not be unheard for the captain to physically strike a subordinate for a mistake. In Flight 801 transcript for the Guam approach, after the pilot says he is tired, the pilot remarks on the heavy rainfall in the region. He is trying the most deferential way possible to draw attention to the bad weather and the difficulties of the visual approach, with no backup plan. When Guam comes in sight, the flight engineer says that the weather radar has been very helpful, but he's trying to cite the flight engine, trying to point out that the weather radar shows trouble ahead. Western communications is transmitter oriented. The speaker must make sure that the message is understood. Repeating as necessary, give Korea's high PDI, receiver oriented communication culture, the co-pilot and flight engineer of Flight 801 will expect the captain to bring up any lack of understanding, but he is too excited to pay close attention. Section 13. 2000 Korean Air brought in David Greenberg from Delta Airlines to run their flight operations. He required all Korean air pilots to be or become fluent in English, the international language of air traffic control. Speaking English also made it easier for the flight crews to free themselves from cultural legacy that limited their ability to confront one another. As VOR beacons becomes led Flight 801 into the side of Nimitz Hill, the ground proximity warning system alerts the crew had been dangerously close to the ground. The crew is confused. Having forgotten the beacon is not by the runway, the co-pilot recommends a missed approach. The flight engineer says go around. The proximity warning system counts down the distance to the ground until impact. The crash investigation determined the co-pilot probably could have saved the plane if he had pulled the plane up when he first suggested a missed approach. Chapter 7 Analysis The Ethnic Theory of Plane Crashes. Cultural legacy influences a success and failure, but adjusting the impact can change the outcomes. Gladwell opens with a comparison of plane crashes, the movie versus plane crashes in real life, pointing out the irony that plane crashes are not typically the result of big dramatic problems, but an accumulation of small issues, malfunctions, and errors. As Gladwell has shown, small elements add up to create success. Small elements can also add up to create failure. The Avianca flight faced a collection of issues: poor weather, a flight delay, a minor technical malfunction, and three holding patterns, a little conversation between the pilot and co-pilot. There was miscommunication that caused the plane to run out of gas. The crash of Korean flight 801 seems ironic, since all seemed well to the pilot of the plane, yet the aircraft crashed, resulting in the deaths of 228 people. Upon investigation, Korean Air Flight 801 experienced a technical issue, a tired pilot, and bad weather. To ameliorate these issues, the crew would have needed to communicate and work together, which didn't happen. Both planes crashed because of poor communication, resulting from lack of awareness and cultural legacy. Mitigated speech, a way of talking, shows respect to superior, downplays meaning to prevent embarrassment or offense, offers one example of cultural legacy. Kyle explains the seeming irony that planes are safer when the pilot with lesser experience is in charge. A less experienced flyer will use mitigated speech to defer to a pilot of higher rank. If the more experienced pilot is the one communicating, he or she is not afraid to speak up. Gladwell suggests this strict hierarchy can be dangerous. If those lower in the pecking order feel uncomfortable speaking up, this danger can be mitigated if everyone is understood to be working towards the same end. Or if their cultural concerns, but if there are cultural concerns that keep someone from being able to speak the truth, terrible things can happen. He notes that Avianca cockpit was too intimidated to speak up, even though they knew they were running low on fuel. Ratwatt notes in his interview with the American pilot would have insisted on landing without worrying about offending anyone. Glauer emphasizes the extremely polite conversation in contrast to the immediate danger of the Avanca pilot. Glauer shares a bit of flight transcript from the Korean Air Flight 801, highlighting extreme deference a member of the flight crew would show to a pilot through the actions of the words. In these cases, mitigated speech was not polite, but a dangerous result of cultural legacy. Different cultural places, different importance of ideas and individualism, which can in turn affect the idea of success. Hofstede's dimensions, the method can be used to compare cultural differences, including individualism. The U.S. scores the highest on the scale. Recall that Gladwell started Outliers, dispelling the myth of individual success. Gladwell notes the scale also ranks how comfortable different cultures are with ambiguity or uncertainty avoidance. He highlights the Hofstede's power distance index (PDI), which relates to views on authority. The Avianca crash appears in a different light, knowing the Colombian cultural reluctance to stand up to authority. Gower relates the PDI to the airline industry's concerns with eliminating the mitigated speech, just as the background impacts New York attorneys and Kentucky feuding families. It impacts airline pilots. By explaining and adjusting cultural legacy, Korean Air turned around its poor safety record. Gower questions why individuals have such a tough time acknowledging cultural impact on our personalities. He immediately answers the questions who we are cannot be separated from where we're from. And when we ignore the fact that plane crash in this statement, his reference to planes crashing is both literal and metaphorical. Through an awareness of the way different cultures look at the language and individuals in society can help foster successful outcomes. Chapter 8 Marita's Bargain. Section 1. Gladwell discusses the formation of the KIPP School in South Bronx in the 1990s. This middle school served almost entirely minority students, of which three-quarters from the single-parent homes and 90% qualified for free or reduced lunch. After 10 years of operation, KIPP is one of the most desirable schools in New York City. By the end of 8th grade, 84% of the students are at or above grade level in mathematics. More than 50 KIPP schools have opened across the United States. Section 2. Public schools in the United States were heavily reformed in the early 19th century. The reformers wanted to ensure that every child had the opportunity to go to school and learn skills required for productive citizenship. The reformers also believed that students should not get too much schooling, thus the specifically American long summer vacation was instituted. Gladwell points out similarity to agriculture in America, where fields must lay fallow for stretches of time to stay fertile cultivation. Section 3. Carl Alexander, a sociologist at Johns Hopkins University, studied first grade public school students in Baltimore, comparing students at the end of the school year to resist from the fall and fall. He discovered that during the school year, students of every socioeconomic background make similar progress, but over Summer students from the poorest homes either regress or remain stagnant, while students from the middle class and affluent families make more progress. Schools are not failing underprivileged students. It is a lack of learning when they are not in school. Asian schools do not have long summer vacations. The average United States school has 180 classroom days. The average South Korean school has 220. The average Japanese school has 243. The success of KIPP schools is found in adapting lessons from rice paddy farming. Section 4. David Levine, one of the founders of the first KIPP school, describes a rigorous schedule. During the week, students attend class from 7:25 a.m. to 5 p.m. and have after-school activities until 7 p.m. Schools on Saturdays is from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. During July, there are 3 weeks of school from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. The longer days permit teachers to take longer to explain concepts and give students more time to digest the information. One of the math teachers states that standard math education in America is so rapid fire that only students who understand concepts quickly succeed. Section 5. Make Marita, a KIPP student, wakes up at 5:45 a.m. Gets home at after 5:30 p.m. She does homework until 9 or 10 p.m. Stopping only to dinner. If she stays up later than 11, she has difficulty staying awake in class. School sleep schedule is standard for KIPP's middle school students. Section 6. Marita's experience is not typical for most 12-year-olds, and not what most parents would want. Marita has chosen to exchange part of her childhood for a chance at success, which she uses to have friends in public school system. She now only has friends at KIPP. 90% of KIPP students receive scholarships to private high schools, and 80% of KIPP's graduates go to college. Gladwell revisits the various cases through outliers. Outliers are those who have been given opportunities and those who have the strength and presence to mind to seize them. Instead of fixating on a myth that only the best and brightest can succeed, society could endeavor to create more opportunities for everyone. Analysis. If an individual does not come home from a culture that encourages support success in society or help by creating a culture that does. Society can help by creating a culture that does. Gladwell suggests that true academic success requires more than 180 days of class per year, which is the average for schools in the United States, but not elsewhere around the world. Using KIPP, Gladwell offers another example, relationship between hard work and success. He shares the story of a fifth grade student who was so bad at math she cried during class, with a teacher at school who believed in slowing down and increased understanding. Not simply rewarding the student who learned quickly, she succeeds and becomes an accounting major in college. Gladwell notes that Marita's life is not typical of most kids her age and her community. Marita wants to succeed, but to get the tools she needs to do so, she needs to separate herself from her old friends and community to make her school KIP, her culture. Gladwell states that Marita seems to agree with the difficult work Kip demands is worth it. Without a naturally occurring cultural legacy to guide her success, Marita relies on culture of success built by her school and new community the school creates for her. Success is not an independent study, but a group project. In closing, Gladwell dispels the mythical belief that it's the best and brightest who rise to the top of it, as if it were by magic. He returns to the other outliers he discussed throughout the book, noting that good fortune of being born at the right time, being in the right place, and getting the lucky break, even though the lucky break falls years worth no one else wanted to do. He notes the importance of cultural background to success or the need to address the change of cultural legacy to find achievement. He reinforces that success doesn't come from being the smartest or most willing to seize the metaphorical bootstraps. Through Gladwell does not dismiss hard work. He emphasizes the vital need for community support and available opportunity to create more success and build a better world. Success does not occur in a vacuum. Chapter 9. Marita's Bargain. Section 1. Gladwell discusses the formation of the Skip School in South Bronx. This middle school serves almost entirely three-quarters of single-parent homes. 9% qualify for free or reduced lunch. After 10 years, epilogue. A Jamaican story. Daisy Nation gave birth to two twin girls in 1931 in Jamaica. She and her husband were both school teachers. When the twins were 11, they received scholarships to a boarding school near the North Coast. After the boarding school, both twins attended University College in London. One of the twins, Joyce, fell in love with a man named Graham. They got married and moved to Canada. Joyce became a successful writer and gave birth to the author Malcolm Gladwell. Oh, he's Jamaican. Garwood points out that many opportunities of his mother given. She and her sister received scholarships to boarding school just a year after they were instituted, and Joyce was only able to continue attending because her sister earned two scholarships. Daisy Nation borrowed a large sum of money to pay for Joyce's tuition in England. Section 3. Daisy Nation also benefited from a series of opportunities. Her great-grandfather, William, was her great-grandfather was William Ford, an Irishman who moved to Jamaica in 1784. He purchased a West African slave as his concubine and had a son. Unlike the American South, Jamaican society had many more opportunities for the colored class. Skin color was, however, still a factor. The lighter one's skin tone, the more he or she would accomplish. In addition to being descended from a mixed race ancestors, Daisy was also surrounded by educated families, members, and successful businessmen. Even from the time of Daisy's nation, great-grandfather Jamaican families would put all their resources into whichever of the children had the lightest skin, and people often ignored the branches of their family with the darker skin. When Joyce first lived in Graham in England, they were once evicted when the landlord found out that Joyce was Jamaican. Joyce, initially angry, realized that in her life she had treated people poorly because they had darker skin than she did. Kyle reveals all the opportunities in various stories throughout the book, and the series of opportunities that brought his mother to college in London. He submits that many more people could have fulfilled lives if they had the same opportunities. Analysis Epilogue, a Jamaica story. Throughout Outliers, Gladwell shows that success does not merely come from individual achievement, but from a variety of factors, including cultural legacy. While he plays the role of the journalist focusing on examples of other individuals, he turns on his own story and the story of his family, specifically his mother. Gladwell can't talk about his mother's opportunities without talking about his grandmother. There's, he focuses on the opportunities Daisy Nation had in Jamaica because of her skin color. She also benefited from a legacy of a family who believed in education and had a knowledge of business. Like others, Gladwell introduced throughout the book his grandmother's cultural legacy contributed to her success, as well as the success of her children and grandchildren. Gladwell shares that his mother and grandmother both had complicated feelings about Jamaican cultural beliefs surrounding skin color. Having facing to discrimination because of the system, but also having benefited from it. Gladwell closes the book reinforcing for the final time that the most successful people don't rise on their own, but as a result of history, legacy, community, and fortunate opportunities driving their achievements and making them possible. The self-made man or woman, the rugged individualist, is a folk tale. Thank you.